Gerald Holt didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved the door open so hard it cracked against the wall, and every man in that timber office turned to look. His face was red. Not from the cold, Mara could tell. From something else. Something practiced. "Empty your pockets," he pointed straight at her. "Now." She was holding the camp ledger. She'd been holding it for 4 years. And in the 30 seconds it took Gerald to reach into her desk drawer and pull out a key she had never seen before in her life, everything she had built, every early morning, every careful entry, every ounce of trust she had earned one page at a time, was gone. "Thief," he said. Loud enough for everyone. Nobody moved to defend her. Nobody asked a single question. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do, and the whole room believed the lie, then you already know exactly what Mara felt standing there. This is her story. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow Mara's story all the way through, because what happens next will stay with you. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, a like means more than you know. The morning Mara Ellison was thrown out of Iron Creek Timber Camp, the sky had already turned the color of old pewter. That particular gray, the kind that sat heavy and low like a ceiling about to collapse, was something the older loggers recognized. They'd grown up reading skies the way other men read almanacs. One of them, a man named Doss, who'd worked the mountain for 30 years, stepped out of the bunkhouse that morning, looked up, and went straight back inside without saying a word to anyone. He started checking the gaps around his window frame. Mara noticed. She noticed everything. She was in the records office, a narrow, cold room that smelled permanently of pine sap and ink, when she heard the first raised voice outside. She didn't look up immediately. Raised voices at Iron Creek weren't rare. Men who spent all week in freezing timber country and all weekend losing money at cards had a tendency to get loud. She finished the line she was writing, capped the ink bottle, and then looked up. Gerald Holt was standing in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin pushed forward in that way he had, like he was bracing against a wind that only he could feel. He was 26, 2 years older than Mara, and he had the soft, unfinished look of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered to him. His father owned Iron Creek. Gerald owned everything that came with that. She didn't trust him. She'd stopped trusting him about 3 months into her first year at camp when she'd caught a discrepancy in the supply invoices. A small one, easy to miss, the kind that looked like a rounding error if you didn't look closely. She'd looked closely. She hadn't said anything to anyone. She'd just started keeping a second set of notes, private ones. In a journal she kept inside the lining of her coat, not in any drawer. That instinct, she would later think, was the only reason she survived at all. Gerald came through the office door without knocking. The door hit the wall, and the single oil lamp on her desk flickered. Behind him came 2 men she knew by face, Crane and Pudge. Camp hands who followed Gerald around the way, stray dogs followed anyone who might eventually feed them. Behind them came Robert Holt, Gerald's father, the owner. He looked tired in a way that had become permanent, the kind of exhaustion that lives behind a man's eyes and never fully clears, no matter how much he sleeps. "Mara." Gerald's voice was flat. He was performing calm. "Empty your pockets." She looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me." He walked to her desk. Not around it, to it. He put both hands on the edge of it, right on top of the open ledger, and leaned toward her. "The payroll chest is missing. 63 men's wages, 12 days before Christmas." The room seemed to shrink. She was aware of every man who had crowded into the doorway, aware of how little space there was, aware of the cold pressing in through the thin walls. Her hands were very still on the ledger beneath his palms. "I haven't touched the payroll chest," she said. She said it evenly. She was proud of that later. She did not say "I swear" or "I promise" or "please, I would never." She said it the way a person says something that is simply true, with nothing extra attached to it, because the truth doesn't need decoration. Gerald reached into her desk drawer. She watched his hand go in. She watched it come back out holding a key she had never seen in her life. A brass key, small, slightly tarnished, with a red thread tied around the bow of it. She knew what it was before he said it. She'd seen that key once, 6 weeks ago, hanging on a hook in the camp office. She'd registered it the way she registered everything, automatically, without meaning to, and filed it away in the back of her mind. It was the key to the payroll strongbox, The one only Robert Holt and his head clerk were supposed to have copies of. "Found in your drawer," Gerald said. He held it up so the men in the doorway could see it clearly. He was performing for them, she realized. This had been rehearsed. "That's not possible," she said. Her voice stayed level, but her heart was doing something painful and fast inside her chest. "I've never had that key." "Seems like you did." "I'm telling you I haven't. And I'm telling you this came out of your drawer." Gerald set the key on the desk between them with a small, deliberate click. "Along with this." He put down a folded piece of paper. "A receipt from a trading post in Cutler. $60 in goods, bought 3 days ago." "You have $60 to spend, Mara? On a record clerk's pay?" She stared at the paper. She had never been to Cutler in her life. She had never once in 4 years left this camp, except to walk to the tree line and back. She barely had $6 to her name. "That's not mine," she said. "It has your name on it." "Then someone wrote my name on it." Gerald straightened. He looked back at his father, and something passed between them. But it wasn't what Mara expected. Robert Holt wasn't looking at his son with satisfaction or relief. He was looking at the floor. There was something in his face that she couldn't read yet, something she would understand much later. "The camp can't have a thief in the records office," Gerald said. He turned back to her. "You're done here. Collect what's yours. You've got 20 minutes. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She looked past Gerald at the men crowded in the doorway. She looked at their faces, one by one. Doss, the weather reader, was staring at his boots. A young logger named Ellison. She'd helped him write a letter to his mother 2 months ago, sat with him for an hour because he couldn't get the words right, was looking at the wall just above her head. Nobody met her eyes. Nobody said a single word. She understood something then, something she could feel settling into her bones like cold. It didn't matter what was true. What mattered was what the man with the power to tell the story chose to say. And Gerald Holt had already told his story. He told it before he'd ever walked through that door. Her 20 minutes began. She didn't cry. She wanted to. There was something enormous pressing at the back of her throat, something that had no name yet. But she pressed her lips together and went to her cot in the women's dormitory. There was only one other woman at Iron Creek, a laundress named Bet, who worked 6 days a week and minded her own business fiercely. Betty was standing in the doorway when Mara came in. "Don't," Mara said. Bet closed her mouth. Then she did something Mara didn't expect. She moved to the narrow shelf above her own cot and came back with a pair of wool socks, thick ones, hand-knitted, and pressed them into Mara's hands without a word. Mara looked at the socks. She thought about saying she didn't need them. She thought about pride, about what it looked like to take charity from someone when you'd just been accused of stealing from everyone. She put the socks in her bag. She put in everything practical she could carry. Extra underlayers, her heaviest coat, the hand axe she kept under the mattress more out of habit than fear, the tin cup she used every morning. She thought carefully about weight, about what would matter and what wouldn't. She had done this before in a different way, when she was 11 years old and the woman from the county came to take her from the only house she'd ever lived in. She had stood in her small bedroom and decided what was worth carrying. She knew how to do this. The journal in her coat lining. She didn't take it out. She left it where it was, flat against her ribs. She picked up her bag and walked out into the yard. The cold hit her like an open hand. The sky had gone darker in those 20 minutes, not toward night, but toward storm. The gray had deepened to something almost green at the edges, the kind of color that meant the temperature was still falling and hadn't decided yet where it would stop. Mara had grown up partly in mountain country before the orphanage, and she knew what that green meant. She was the only one who seemed to. Gerald was waiting in the yard with Crane and Pudge. He didn't say anything else to her, didn't explain or justify or even look at her with the satisfaction she might have expected. He just watched her walk toward the camp gate with his arms crossed over his chest, and that blankness on his face was worse, somehow, than anger would have been. Anger would have meant she mattered enough to feel something about. The gate was a wooden frame strung with wire, more symbolic than structural. She pushed through it. She heard it swing shut behind her. She kept walking. The logging road went north from the camp gate, and for the first quarter-mile it was clear enough. Packed snow, frozen hard, the kind that held your weight without crumbling. On either side, the timber country spread out in all directions, and Mara knew from the camp maps she'd memorized that the nearest settlement was Harlan Creek, roughly 11 miles east through terrain that would be manageable in summer and genuinely dangerous in winter, especially now, especially with that sky. She had been walking for 20 minutes when the first wind came. It wasn't the storm itself, not yet. Just the edge of it, a cold front pushing ahead of the main body. It cut through the layers she was wearing, and she felt it against her skin like a warning. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, tucked her chin down, and kept moving. She was thinking. That was the thing about Mara Ellison that most people at Iron Creek had failed to understand. They saw a heavy-set young woman who kept quiet and did her job and didn't push for anything she wasn't offered, and they read that as passivity. They thought she was patient because she had nowhere better to be. They didn't understand that the patience was a tool. The observation was a tool. The quietness was a tool. She had been building a picture of that camp, of the people in it, of the way things moved and where the money went and who owed what to whom for 4 years. Not because she had a plan, just because she couldn't help it. It was how her mind worked. She was thinking about the payroll chest. Gerald had said it was missing, but Mara had been in that office 3 days ago. She was in that office every day, and the chest had been there. She remembered it because one of the handles was loose, and it made a particular sound when you set it down wrong, a low, clunking rattle. She had heard that sound 3 days ago when Robert Holt had unlocked the office safe and checked the chest's contents. Gerald had been standing in the doorway, watching his father with an expression that she'd noticed but not understood at the time. She understood it now. The wind picked up. She was about 1.5 miles from camp when she heard something, a sound from the tree line to her left, a cracking and settling, the kind that heavy snowfall makes when it becomes too much for a branch to hold. But there was no snowfall yet, just that pressing gray and the building wind. She stopped walking. She looked at the trees, and then she looked at the landscape ahead, at the road that went east toward Harlan Creek, and she calculated. 11 miles. The storm coming. Her supplies. 3 days of hard bread and dried meat if she was careful. 1 wool blanket, fire materials, the hand axe, her knowledge. Harlan Creek was the logical destination. The road was known. Other people had walked it, but logic, she reminded herself, was only as good as the conditions it operated in, and the conditions were about to change dramatically. Mara had filed it away. The road to Harlan Creek was 11 miles of open terrain in a building storm. 2 miles in the other direction was a possible shelter. A chance. She turned north. The terrain off the logging road was harder. Uneven snow over frozen ground, deadfall in unpredictable places. The tree cover dense enough to block what little light the storm clouds had left. She moved carefully. She was not fast. She had never been fast, and she'd made a kind of peace with that. Speed wasn't always the thing that kept you alive. Attention kept you alive. Reading what was in front of you kept you alive. She watched every step, tested the ground when it looked uncertain, moved around the places that seemed wrong rather than through them. She had been moving for nearly 40 minutes when she heard it. Water. Moving water. In winter, in these mountains, that sound had a particular quality, thin and high and relentless, because the only water still moving was either too fast to freeze or too deep. It meant she was close to something. She pushed through a stand of young birches, their white trunks pale against the dark sky, and came out on a ledge of stone above a frozen creek bed. Above her, maybe 30 feet, maybe 35, a waterfall came down from the rock face. Most of it was ice now, a thick curtain of frozen white, but at the center a thin thread of water still ran, the thread moving fast enough to resist the cold. The sound she'd heard. She looked at the rock face behind the falls. There was a gap. She almost missed it. The ice had grown across most of the opening, filling it in, making it look like just another section of frozen rock. But the angle was wrong. A natural rock face didn't have that particular shadow, that depth. Something was behind there. Mara set down her bag. She looked at the gap, looked at the ice in front of it, looked at the route she'd need to take to reach it, along the ledge, stepping carefully, keeping her weight centered. She thought about all the ways it could go wrong. The ice could be thin. The ledge could give. Whatever was behind that frozen curtain could be nothing, just a shallow depression in the rock, nothing useful. She picked up her bag, adjusted it on her shoulder, and started across the ledge. The first step was solid. The second was solid. The third made a sound that she didn't like, a low, resonant creak, the kind that means the ice is thinking about its options. She moved her foot wider, toward the rock, where the footing was more certain, and kept going. She reached the edge of the frozen falls and pushed her hand against the ice. It was thick here, maybe 8 inches, built up over what she guessed had been several consecutive weeks of freezing. The gap was just wide enough. She turned sideways, pulled her bag in front of her, and pushed through. The cold inside was different, drier, still. After the wind outside, the stillness landed on her like something physical. She stood there, in the dark behind the waterfall, and let her eyes adjust. What she saw made her stop breathing for a moment. It wasn't a cave exactly, more of a deep recess in the rock, maybe 15 feet across and 8 feet deep at the widest point. But someone had been here before. Someone had been here deliberately. Along one wall there were notches cut into the stone at regular intervals, the kind of notches that hold horizontal poles. The poles were gone, rotted away or taken, but the notches were still there, precise and purposeful. In the back corner there was a stone ring, a fire pit, unmistakably, with a deliberately angled crack above it in the rock face that would have drawn the smoke out and up. There was a low platform of flat stones that had been arranged too carefully to be natural, and on the far wall, barely visible, someone had carved a series of marks. Not words, but patterns. The kind a person makes when they're keeping track of something over a long period of time. Mara stood in the dark and the cold and the sudden stillness, and she looked at all of it. "Okay," she said, out loud, to no one. Her voice sounded strange to her, flat and close, absorbed by the stone. She hadn't spoken to herself before. She wasn't the type. But something about this place required it. Required some acknowledgement that she was here, that she was standing in it, that whoever had built this careful hidden thing in the rock, whoever had cut those notches and laid those stones and carved those marks, had done so because they needed to survive when the world outside had decided they shouldn't. She understood that. The wind outside was building. She could hear it even through the ice and rock, a low, steady moan that was climbing in pitch. The storm was coming now. It was coming in earnest. Mara Ellison set her bag down on the stone platform, straightened her back, and looked around at everything she had to work with. She started taking inventory. The inventory took her longer than she expected, not because there was so much to assess, but because she kept stopping to think. That was the thing about having a mind that ran the way Mara's did. It didn't stay on one track. She'd be looking at the fire pit, calculating the angle of the smoke channel above it, and then suddenly she'd be back in the camp office watching Gerald's hand come out of her drawer, and she'd have to physically shake herself, press her fingers against the cold stone wall until the sensation brought her back. The cold was useful for that. It was good at demanding your attention. She counted what she had. 3.5 days of food if she was careful, which meant maybe 5 if she was genuinely disciplined. The hand axe, 1 wool blanket, fire materials, a small tin of sulfur matches, a stub of tallow candle, a piece of char cloth she kept out of long habit. The clothes she was wearing, which were good but not designed for extended outdoor survival. Her tin cup. A coil of rope, thin but strong, that she'd grabbed from the nail inside the dormitory door without quite knowing why. 43 cents in coin. A small bone-handled knife that she kept sharp out of pride more than expectation. And the journal, flat against her ribs. She did not take the journal out. Not yet. The fire pit was the first question. She crouched in front of it and examined the smoke channel, a natural crack in the rock that someone had widened deliberately, angled upward at roughly 30 degrees. She couldn't tell where it came out on the exterior face. If it was blocked by ice or debris, lighting a fire inside would fill the shelter with smoke and kill her more efficiently than the cold. She needed to test it before she risked anything. She tore a small piece from the edge of her blanket. Just the edge, just a strip an inch wide, and held it at the mouth of the channel. It took a moment. Then the strip moved. Just slightly, just a gentle pull, but it moved in the right direction, upward and away. The channel was clear. She let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than she realized. The wood situation was the next problem. She had nothing to burn. The shelter was clean. Whoever had used it last had either taken everything when they left, or the years had rotted away whatever organic material remained. She was going to have to go back outside. She looked at the gap in the ice through which she'd entered. The wind sound had changed in the 10 minutes she'd been inside. It had gone from a moan to something with a harder edge, a cutting quality, the kind of sound that meant the storm was no longer arriving. It was here. She gave herself exactly 30 seconds to feel afraid. She counted it in her head. She let the fear be real, let it move through her the way cold moves through wet cloth. and then she put it down. She went back through the gap. The temperature outside had dropped since she'd entered the shelter, and the drop was not small. She felt it hit her face like a thrown bucket of water. The light was wrong now, flat and directionless. The kind of light that meant the sun had been completely swallowed and wasn't coming back. Snow was moving horizontally in the wind, not falling, just moving, stripped from the tops of drifts and carried. That kind of snow didn't accumulate fast, but it found every gap in your clothing. She worked fast. She moved along the base of the rock face, staying close to it where the wind was partially blocked, snapping dead branches from the undersides of the fir trees where they stayed driest. She broke them against her knee into manageable lengths. She found a section of fallen birch that had been down long enough to be partially dried but was still protected from direct moisture by the overhang of rock above it. She worked at it with the hand axe, taking the driest intersections, filling her arms with as much as she could carry without losing her footing. She made 2 trips. On the second trip, the wind caught her from the side, and she went down on one knee, her hand coming out to stop the fall and landing palm flat on snow that was solid enough underneath to skin her. She stayed down for a second, just breathing, her knee throbbing and her palm burning cold. Then she got up and kept going. When she was finally back behind the ice curtain with the wood stacked against the back wall and her hands shaking badly from the cold and the exertion, she allowed herself to feel something that she wouldn't have called relief, more like acknowledgement. She had made it through the first thing. There were going to be many more things. She built the fire small and deliberate. Too large, and she'd exhaust the wood before she knew how long she needed to make it last. She wanted heat, not spectacle. The char cloth caught on the second strike, the tallow candle caught from that, and the smallest pieces of wood caught from the candle, and within 10 minutes she had a fire that was modest and real and producing warmth that moved against her face. She sat in front of it and put her hands out and watched them shake. The shaking took longer to stop than she expected. She'd been colder than she knew. She made herself eat something. A small piece of the dried meat, methodical chewing, not because she was hungry, but because her body needed the fuel. She drank water she melted in her tin cup, holding it close to the fire, drinking slowly. She looked at the carved marks on the far wall. There were 47 of them. She'd counted 3 times. They weren't random. They had a structure, a grouping. Sets of 5, the classic tally, but also something else interspersed. Symbols she didn't immediately recognize. She would think about that later. Right now, she thought about the smoke channel, and the notches in the wall, and the fire pit built by someone who had known exactly what they were doing, and she allowed herself to feel something she was more comfortable with than fear. Curiosity. She slept in short intervals that first night, not because she chose to, but because her body had a different opinion than her mind about what the priority was. She'd wake every hour or so, check the fire, add wood, adjust herself on the flat stones of the sleeping platform where she'd spread the blanket. The platform had been built at a slight angle. She hadn't noticed this immediately, but woke to it, the way you wake to a dripping faucet in a house you've just moved into. Someone had tilted the platform deliberately. She worked out why around the third waking. Cold air sinks, and a sleeping body radiates heat upward. And if you're angled correctly relative to the fire pit, the convection of warm air carries along the platform's length and keeps the sleeping surface marginally warmer than the floor. It wasn't a large difference, but in survival, no difference is small. She lay in the dark and thought about the person who had figured that out. By morning. Not that she could see morning through the rock and ice, but she could hear the storm at its worst, which told her it was the deepest part of the night had passed. She had made a decision. She was not going to wait here for rescue, because rescue was not coming. She was not going to walk toward Harlan Creek in a blizzard, because that was a way to die. She was going to stay here, and she was going to make this work. And not just barely work, but actually work. Because barely was not going to be enough. She needed to think clearly, and to think clearly she needed to stop thinking about Gerald's face, and the key on the desk, and the silence from the men in the doorway. And she needed to start thinking about water, heat, food, air, priorities in order. She started with the air. The smoke channel worked. She'd established that, but she needed to understand it better. Needed to understand how the air moved through the shelter as a whole, where cold came in and where it went out. She spent 2 hours moving around the space with a piece of burning char cloth held at different heights, watching the smoke curl and move. She found 3 places where cold air entered around the perimeter of the ice curtain. She found that the back corner, near the fire pit, had a natural warm pocket that was 4 or 5 degrees warmer than anywhere else in the space. She found that if she positioned herself correctly on the sleeping platform and the fire was kept at a consistent size, the heat distribution was actually quite good for a space with no insulation. Water was straightforward in theory and harder in practice. There was the waterfall, technically, but accessing it meant going through the gap in the ice, which meant the outside. And she didn't know yet how often she could do that safely, without paying too large a physical cost. She found that ice from the underside of the curtain, the part that was permanently in shadow, was cleaner and clearer than the surface ice that had accumulated frost and debris. She chipped pieces of it into her tin cup to melt. One cup took longer than she liked. She would need a second container, and she didn't have one. She solved this on the third day, when she noticed that the fire pit stone ring included one flat stone on the north side that was slightly cupped, naturally cupped, just the way the stone had fractured. She set this over the fire carefully and packed snow into the cup of it and watched it melt. It was clumsy and slow, and the water tasted faintly of mineral, but it was water, and it was real. Food was the hardest problem. She had extended her supplies by being truly severe with herself. Not one bite more than what she decided each morning was the day's allocation. She was hungry all the time, genuinely, achingly hungry in a way that made itself known constantly, a low grinding complaint from somewhere around her midsection that she had learned to simply hear without responding to. She knew from the camp medical book she'd read twice out of boredom that the human body could manage on less than people thought, that the first 3 days were the worst before certain systems adjusted. She was on day 4 when the adjustment happened. She still felt the hunger, but it became background noise. She hunted by thinking, not by effort. She had no traps and no skill in making them from nothing, so she sat with that problem the way she sat with the ledger discrepancy and looked at all the angles until something useful came. She was a heavy young woman who'd spent 4 years in a timber camp office. She was not a woodswoman. She did not pretend to herself that she was. But she was a person who paid attention, and paying attention was enough to notice, on the 4th morning, that there were tracks in the snow near the base of the waterfall ice. Small ones, a rabbit or something close to it, following a route that ran along the protected base of the rock face. She didn't have traps. She had rope. Making a snare from the thin coil of rope took her the better part of a day. She got it wrong twice. The third attempt held the shape she needed. She set it where the tracks ran closest to the rock, supported it on the small branch framework, the way she'd read about it once in a camp supply manual, and went back inside. She checked it twice over the next day, each time coming back empty-handed, and on the third check she found the snare had caught something and the something had gotten away, leaving behind a smear of blood on the snow and a section of rope bitten through. She sat down in the snow in the wind and looked at the empty snare for a moment. "All right," she said out loud to the mountain. "All right." She fixed the snare with a stronger section of rope. 2 days later, she caught a rabbit. The rabbit was smaller than she'd hoped, and she wasted some of it the first time she tried to clean it because she didn't know exactly what she was doing and her knife slipped twice. But she learned from what went wrong, and she didn't waste any more after that. She ate carefully, and she preserved what she could, and the rabbit bought her 4 more days. She was keeping track, not just of days, but of everything: temperature patterns, wind behavior, the way the sound of the falls changed when the cold deepened versus when it eased slightly. She was reading the mountain the way she'd read the camp ledgers, patiently, looking for patterns, building a picture that was bigger than any single data point. She scratched her own marks into the wall beside the ones left by whoever had been here before. Days, temperature guesses, wind direction, food inventory. It made her feel less like she was drowning and more like she was working. The shelter needed insulation. She knew this with increasing certainty as the second week began, and the temperature dropped in a way that was notable even by the standards she'd already adapted to. The fire was doing what it could, but the stone walls conducted cold the way a cast iron pan conducts heat, and she was losing warmth through the rock itself. She needed to break that conductance. Bark, she thought. Fir bark stripped from the underside of fallen trees where it was still attached and partially dried. Packed into the gaps and laid against the lower walls, it would provide some insulation. Not enough. Not ideal. But the difference between some and none was the difference she was working with, and she had learned not to reject partial solutions. She made 3 trips over 2 days to gather bark. Working fast and returning before the cold could compromise her too badly. She packed it against the walls and along the edges of the sleeping platform. She was not a carpenter, and the result looked improvised and chaotic, and would have embarrassed anyone who knew what they were doing. But the shelter was measurably warmer the following night, and she knew it wasn't her imagination because she managed, for the first time since she'd arrived, to sleep for 4 consecutive hours without waking to check the fire. She woke from that sleep with tears on her face and didn't know why. She lay there in the dark, feeling the unfamiliar wetness on her skin in the dry cold, and she tried to trace it back. She hadn't been dreaming about the camp, or not that she could remember. She hadn't been dreaming about Gerald or Robert Holt, or the men who'd stood in the doorway without saying a word. She'd been dreaming, she thought hazily, about a kitchen. A specific kitchen, yellow walls, a window over the sink with a view of a field. She had no idea whose kitchen it was. She had no memory of any such kitchen from her own life. She pressed the back of her hand to her face and wiped the tears away and got up to check the fire. There were some things she decided that she was not going to examine too closely right now. The smoke channel continued to function, but she began to worry about it in a new way on the 12th day. The storm that had driven her here had paused. Not ended, she didn't think, just paused. The way a serious storm sometimes eased for a day before coming back harder. And in the relative stillness, she could hear something dripping from above. Meltwater. Running down the rock face and finding its way into gaps, including, possibly, the smoke channel. If the channel iced over from the outside, if the meltwater ran in and refroze, she'd lose her ventilation and her fire both. She needed to address this before the next freeze cycle. She couldn't reach the exterior exit of the channel from inside. She couldn't go up the rock face in the current conditions, even if she wanted to. But she could do something about the intake end. She could build a deflector, a shaped piece of stone placed at the channel's mouth inside the shelter that would redirect the warmth of the fire upward into the channel more efficiently, drying any moisture that came down before it could accumulate. She spent an afternoon sourcing the right piece of stone, chipping it to the right shape with the hand axe, a process that was both physically taxing and deeply irritating because she kept getting it almost right and then wrong. On the 4th attempt, it was right enough. She placed it at the mouth of the channel. That night she kept the fire slightly hotter than usual to test the draw. The smoke went where it was supposed to go. She caught 2 more rabbits over the following week and found, in a protected crevice about 50 yards along the base of the rock face, a stand of dried rosehips on a thorn bush that hadn't been completely buried by snow. Rosehips, she knew from the camp medical book, were practical food, high in something the body needed in winter, resistant to cold spoilage. She gathered every one she could reach, scratching her wrists and hands on the thorns, and brought them back and ate a few each day. They were sour and seedy and not pleasant, and she didn't care even slightly. By the end of the 2nd week, she had a system. Not a comfortable life, nothing like comfort, but a system. The shelter was weatherproof enough. The food was insufficient but sustainable, especially if she kept the snare active and the rosehip supply held. The water solution worked. The fire management was something she'd refined to the point where she could predict how long a given bundle of wood would last within 20 minutes, which allowed her to sleep longer before checking it. She stopped thinking about Iron Creek. That surprised her. She'd expected it to occupy her constantly, the anger, the injustice, the faces of the men who hadn't helped her. But survival took up so much cognitive space that there wasn't room for sustained resentment. She would think about Gerald sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, and the thought would move through her and be gone. She couldn't afford to hold on to it. What she thought about instead was the shelter, the person who built it, those 47 marks on the wall, and the symbols interspersed between the tally groups. She'd been looking at them every day, and by the end of the 2nd week she thought she understood some of them. A circle with a line through it, repeated 3 times, appeared above sections of the tally that she could correlate with what she'd observed about weather patterns. 3 particularly bad stretches, marked with a warning. A shape that looked like a bird, or possibly a fish, repeated near what seemed to be the midpoint of the marks. She didn't know what it meant. She kept looking. On the 17th day, the storm came back. She knew it was coming 4 hours before it arrived. The sound of the falls changed. The thin thread of moving water went silent, which meant the temperature had dropped suddenly enough to freeze even the fastest moving part of the stream. The air inside the shelter had a particular electrical quality, a tension that she'd noticed once before just before a thunderstorm when she was 12 years old, and hiding under a tree because she had nowhere else to be. She stacked more wood. She inventoried her food. She checked every gap she'd packed with bark and repacked two that had shifted. She moved to the warmest point of the shelter, the back corner near the fire pit, and she pulled the blanket around herself and she waited. The storm hit the mountain like something trying to pull it loose from the earth. She could hear it even through the ice and the rock. A sustained roar that was not wind exactly, or not only wind, but something larger, a sound produced by the collision of weather systems of a scale that reduced every human effort to the size of match flame. The ice curtain at the shelter's entrance flexed visibly. Visibly, in the firelight, she could see the outer edge of the frozen falls vibrate like a slow drumhead. The sound pressure was physical, something you felt in your chest rather than heard. She sat in the corner with the blanket around her and the fire as right as she could make it, and she listened to the mountain be enormous. And she was not calm. She wasn't pretending to be calm, not even to herself. But she was there. She was present in her body, aware of her heartbeat, aware of her breathing, aware of the warmth against her face from the fire, and she was there. Hours passed. She didn't sleep, not properly, just drifted in and out of a shallow state that wasn't rest but kept her from burning resources her body didn't have to spare. At some point the sound peaked, a sustained howl that lasted long enough she thought it would never stop, and then it began, slowly, incrementally, to ease. Not end, ease. The storm was still there, was going to be there for a long time. But the worst of it had passed over, and what remained was serious weather, not catastrophic weather. She added wood to the fire, she heated water. She ate her allocated portion of dried meat and 2 rose hips, and she sat in the warmth her own careful work had preserved, and she looked at the 47 marks on the wall. Whoever had made those marks had sat in this same corner, possibly, with a fire going and a storm outside, and had made a mark in the stone to say, "I was here. I counted this. This is the record of what I survived." She took the bone-handled knife from her coat pocket. She stood up and walked to the wall. She found a clear section of stone beside the existing marks, ran her hand over it, finding the spot. Then she pressed the tip of the knife against the rock and scratched a single line. Day 1 of her own count. She went back to the fire. She sat down. The storm moved over the mountain and took its time about it, and she let it take its time, and she tended the fire the way you tend the one thing that is genuinely keeping you alive when everything else has walked away. With complete attention, with nothing withheld, with a steadiness that didn't look like strength from the outside, but was the only kind of strength that had ever actually mattered. Outside, in the valley below, Iron Creek Timber Camp was beginning to understand what a real blizzard meant. The cabins were straining. The supply situation was becoming something other than a background worry. And not a single person in that camp was thinking about Mara Ellison, the record keeper they'd thrown out into the cold. She was already dead, as far as they were concerned. The mountains had taken her. It was unfortunate, maybe, but these things happened. She was not dead. She was counting. She had 31 marks on the wall when the second man appeared. She almost missed him entirely. It was late afternoon. She could tell by the quality of the light that filtered through the ice curtain, a particular cold amber that lasted maybe 40 minutes before the shelter went fully dark. And she was outside working the snare line. The storm had eased 3 days ago into something she'd categorized as merely severe rather than deadly. And she'd established a rhythm of outdoor work in the eased periods. Wood gathering, snare checking, ice chipping for water, a slow circuit of the rock face looking for anything she might have missed. She kept the circuits short. She kept them purposeful. She did not wander. She was 50 yards from the shelter entrance, crouching near the thorn bush where the rose hips grew. There were a few more she'd spotted, higher up, that she'd been trying to reach, when she heard something that wasn't wind and wasn't the settling of snow-heavy branches. She went still. The sound came again. Lower this time, almost below hearing. It was somewhere between a groan and a cough, and it was coming from the far side of a deadfall about 20 feet ahead of her, a tangle of fallen timber half buried in snow that she'd been navigating around for weeks. Her first instinct was wrong, and she knew it was wrong even as she felt it. Run. Go back to the shelter. Pull the ice curtain closed and stay quiet. She had made herself invisible for 31 days. She had survived on invisibility as much as anything else. Whatever was making that sound was not something she'd planned for, but she didn't run because the sound came a third time and she recognized it. Not the voice, she didn't know the voice, but she recognized the quality of it, the involuntary quality. The kind of sound a person makes when they have stopped choosing to make sounds, and their body is making them instead, without permission, without intent. She'd made sounds like that herself, on the worst nights here, when the cold got into her bones and she couldn't stop shaking, and the shaking produced noise she wasn't aware of until she heard herself. She moved toward the deadfall. I was on the other side of it, half sitting and half fallen against the snowbank behind the log, his legs at an angle that looked wrong. I was wearing a heavy coat, better than hers, actually, a proper wool greatcoat with a full collar. But it was soaked through at the shoulders and arms, which meant he'd been down for long enough for snow to accumulate and melt from his body heat. His hands were bare, both of them. No gloves. In this temperature, bare hands for any significant duration was how you lost fingers. She recognized him. His name was Thomas Bray. He was the school teacher from Harlan Creek, the settlement 11 miles east. He came to Iron Creek 4 times a year to collect the children of timber workers for the monthly lessons that substituted for proper schooling in settlements this remote. She'd seen him twice, once in September, once in October. And both times he'd come into the camp office to check the worker roster against the children's attendance records. I was a precise man, she'd thought, methodical. He had a way of asking questions that suggested he already knew most of the answer and was checking whether you did too. She had not disliked him. She had not thought about him since. She crouched down and looked at his face. He was conscious, barely, and the barely mattered, and his eyes were moving behind the lids in that particular way that meant the brain was still working, but the body had made different decisions about priorities. His lips were gray. Not blue, not yet, but the kind of gray that has blue in its future if nothing changes. "Hey," she said it firmly, not gently. "Hey, open your eyes." Nothing. Thomas Bray. She said his full name deliberately, the way you'd use a person's full name to reach them through sleep or shock. "Open your eyes right now." His eyes opened. They didn't focus for a moment. They moved across the landscape above him without landing on anything, and then they found her face and stopped. He stared at her for a long time. "You're dead," he said. His voice was rough and strange and almost completely without effect. The cold did that, stripped everything back to the most essential words. "I'm not," she said. He kept staring at her. "They said you were dead." They were wrong. She was already looking at his hands. The fingers were a bad color. White at the tips, the dangerous white. Not the pink of cold, but the white of tissue in serious trouble. "Can you move your legs?" He tried. She could see the effort in his face, the concentration, and then a wince. "My left ankle. I went through a drift. There was a gap underneath. It twisted." Not broken, probably. Twisted ankles hurt less than broken ones and produced a different kind of expression. But bad enough. Bad enough to put him on the ground in this cold. "How long have you been down?" she asked. He thought about it. Thinking was slow for him right now. I left the road at midday. I think midday." She looked at the light. 4, maybe 4:30. He'd been on the ground for at least 2 hours, possibly more. "Why were you off the road?" she asked. She was already trying to calculate his weight, his condition, the distance to the shelter, whether she could get him there without making his ankle worse than it already was. She was not small, and she was not frail, but she was not built for carrying a full-grown man through broken snow terrain, and she knew this. "Looking for you," he said. She stopped calculating for a moment. "Looking for me," she repeated. There were questions. He closed his eyes, then seemed to catch himself and force them open again. He knew, on some level, that closing his eyes was dangerous right now. Things that didn't add up. "I went to the camp 2 weeks ago and I asked Robert Holt some questions, and he wouldn't answer properly, and I thought..." He stopped. "I need to sit up." "Don't sit up yet," she said. "Give me a minute to think." She gave herself the minute. She looked at the terrain between here and the waterfall. She looked at him, at his size and his condition. She thought about the rope, which she had with her. She carried it habitually now, always. And she thought about the way the rock face ran, and she thought about what she could and couldn't do. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do. There's a shelter about 50 yards from here. I'm going to help you get there. It's going to hurt. Your ankle is going to hurt the whole time, and there's nothing I can do about that, except tell you it's coming so you're not surprised by it. Can you understand what I'm saying?" He looked at her. "You've been alive out here this whole time." "Yes." "Since they threw you out." Yes. She held out her hand. Can you understand what I'm saying about the shelter? He took her hand. His grip was weak but present. Yes, he said. I understand. Getting Thomas Bray on his feet and moving was one of the hardest physical things Mara had done in 31 days of hard physical things. He was 6 feet and lean, but lean at 6 feet still weighs something substantial, and his left leg could bear almost nothing. And the terrain between the deadfall and the shelter was the kind of broken, drifted snow that made every step a negotiation. She put his arm over her shoulders and took as much of his weight as she could manage, which was more than she would have predicted, because desperation is a remarkable amplifier of capacity. He didn't complain. She gave him credit for that. He made sounds, involuntary sounds, the kind she'd recognized from the other side of the deadfall, when his ankle caught wrong angles. And once he said, "Stop, stop," and she stopped and waited while he breathed through whatever was happening, and then he said, "Okay," and they kept moving. Getting him through the gap in the ice curtain was its own separate problem. He was not built for sideways entry through a narrow opening while non-weight-bearing on one leg. They managed it in a way that was undignified and involved her going through first and pulling while he pushed with his good leg. And at one point the ice curtain shifted and a section of it came down and hit them both with a cascade of ice chunks that were sharper than they had any right to be. And she said something that she would not have said in front of the women at the orphanage. And Thomas Bray, despite everything, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Inside, she got him to the sleeping platform. He sat down heavily, his bad leg extended, his face the particular white gray of someone who had used up everything available in the last 20 minutes. She went straight to the fire, which had burned low, and built it back up faster than she usually allowed herself to. "Put your hands toward the fire," she said. "Not too close. Just toward it." "I know about frostbite," he said, but he put his hands out. "Do you know that rewarming too fast damages tissue?" A pause. "I know that." "Then you know why I said not too close." She heated water. While the water was heating, she looked at his ankle. She had him pull up his trouser leg, and she pressed along the bone carefully, watching his face for the specific expression that meant bone. But what she saw was muscle and ligament, which was still bad but survivable. She tore a strip from the lower edge of his coat lining. He didn't object, which told her something about his current state, and she wrapped the ankle with the kind of even pressure she'd once used on a logger's wrist sprain. She didn't know if she was doing it right. She'd read about it. She did the best version she could imagine. She gave him water when it was warm enough, and then she gave him a piece of dried rabbit and watched him eat it with the focused attention of someone who has moved past the point of tasting food and is simply processing fuel. They didn't speak for a while. The fire settled. The wind outside had a different tone than it had this morning. She'd learned to read the shifts in it, the same way she'd learned to read the light through the ice curtain and the sound of the falls and the temperature differential between the shelter's different zones. This tone was the one that meant conditions were staying stable, not improving but not worsening. Thomas Bray looked around the shelter properly for the first time. He'd been in survival processing mode until now, handling the most immediate inputs, but she could see the moment his brain opened up enough to actually take in where he was. He looked at the walls, the bark insulation, the notched poles, the fire pit and its smoke channel, the stone cup she'd fashioned, the snare rope hanging drying near the fire, the tally marks on the wall. He looked at her. "How long did this take you?" he asked. "I've been adding to it since day 3, she said. "The structure was already here. Someone built it a long time ago. I figured out how it worked and repaired the parts that had deteriorated." He was quiet for a moment. "The smoke goes out through that channel in the rock?" "It's a natural crack. Someone widened it. I built a deflector at the mouth to improve the draw and dry moisture coming down in thaw cycles." He looked at the deflector, the shaped stone she'd spent 4 attempts getting right. "You made that?" "It took me most of a day." He looked back at the marks on the wall, then at the new marks beside them. Her 31 lines, scratched in a different hand, in a different era, but following the same logic. "Count the days. Keep the record." "They told everyone you were dead," he said. He said it without preamble, just placed the information in the air between them. By the second week, Robert Holt called a meeting and said it was a tragedy, that the storm had taken you, and that they'd have a marker put up come spring. Mara looked at the fire. "Robert Holt," she said. "He seemed, I don't know. He didn't seem right. When I went back 3 weeks later to collect records for the county enrollment report, I asked him about you again, about the theft accusation. He gave me the same answers he'd given the first time, almost word for word. People don't do that unless they've rehearsed it. She turned to look at him. What kind of questions did you ask? I asked who witnessed the evidence being found. He said Gerald and two of the camp hands. I asked if there was any independent verification of the receipt from Cutler. He said the trading post confirmed it. Thomas shifted his leg carefully. I asked if the payroll chest had been physically recovered. He said no. She was very still. They said the chest was missing. It was missing. When I asked, it was still missing. He looked at her. A man steals 63 workers' wages and there's no chest. The chest is just gone. And the only person they accuse has no history of dishonesty, no previous disciplinary record, and no means of getting the money out of the camp to spend it, given that she hasn't left the camp perimeter in 4 years. He paused. I looked at the worker access logs. You logged every day of those 4 years. You were at that camp every single day. You looked at the logs, she said. Someone had to. She felt something move through her chest. Not warmth exactly, not gratitude exactly, but something that sat between those two things and ached a little. She had been alone for 31 days. She had been so completely alone that she'd stopped expecting the fact of her innocence to matter to anyone, stopped expecting that anyone would look at it and see it for what it was. She had expected to survive and then to build something for herself, and to simply never go back, and to let the injustice sit in the past like something preserved in ice, present but not alive. She had not expected Thomas Bray. What did Gerald say when you asked him? She said. He wasn't there the second time I came. Robert told me he'd gone to the Eastern Supply Depot. But one of the camp hands, a man named Doss, he stopped. Do you know him? She thought about Doss, checking his window frame on the morning she was thrown out. I know him. He found me outside the main office, after I'd finished with Robert Holt. He looked like he was doing something casual, checking a fence post, but he'd waited for me. I could tell. He said very quietly that I should ask about the camp owner's card debt, specifically a debt to a man in Cutler named Fenn. Thomas paused. Then he walked away. Mara sat with that for a moment. Doss, the weather reader, who'd checked his window and gone back inside and said nothing when she was thrown out. Doss, who had watched and known and stayed silent until he hadn't. Until he found a way to say the thing he needed to say to the one person who might be able to do something with it. People were complicated. She had known this. She had just, in 31 days of solitude, started to forget it. Gerald has gambling debts, she said. I found a discrepancy in the supply invoices about 4 months before they accused me. Small. The kind that gets used to skim money slowly. I kept notes. Thomas looked at her sharply. You have documentation? She reached into her coat. The journal was still there, flat and worn against her ribs, where it had been since the morning she'd packed her things and walked out through the camp gate. She pulled it out and held it for a moment before she handed it to him. He opened it. She watched his face as he read. The way his eyes moved through the entries, the way his expression shifted from careful attention to something sharper. He turned pages, slowed down at certain sections, went back. These invoice discrepancies, he said, they're patterned. Every 6 to 8 weeks, never the same line item twice in a row, always small enough to look like a rounding error if you weren't watching the cumulative total. But you were watching. I was watching. He looked up at her. Who did you plan to tell? She thought about that honestly. I don't know. I hadn't decided. I thought if I could build enough documentation, I'd find the right moment. She paused. I think I waited too long. Or Gerald found out you were watching. She hadn't thought about it that way. She had assumed, she realized now, sitting in the firelight, 31 days into her exile. She had assumed that the accusation against her was purely opportunistic, a convenient way to cover the theft of the payroll chest. She hadn't considered the alternative, that it had been partly defensive, that Gerald had known or suspected that the woman in the records office had seen something and had moved against her before she could move. The thought landed with a weight she hadn't been prepared for. If that's true, she said slowly, then the theft of the payroll chest wasn't just about covering his gambling debt. It was also about removing me. Thomas closed the journal carefully. He held it in both hands. His hands were better now, the color returning, the dangerous white receding. And he looked at her. That makes what he did a great deal more premeditated than a desperate man's bad decision. Yes, she said, it does. Outside, the wind shifted. She heard it in the falls, a change in pitch that she'd cataloged. The temperature was dropping again, settling in for the night. She got up and added wood to the fire, the right amount, not more, and checked the smoke channel and the bark insulation at the shelter's northern wall, where she always lost the most heat overnight. "You can't sleep on that platform with that ankle," she said. "It's not long enough for you to keep your leg elevated, which you need to do." "I'm fine where I am," he said. "You're not, but that's not the point." She looked at the platform and the floor and made a calculation she didn't entirely like. "I'll sleep on the floor, you take the platform." "Miss Ellison, the floor is warmer than it was because I insulated the base of the walls. I've slept on worse." She handed him the blanket. "You'll need this more than I will tonight because you burned through your reserves getting here. I still have mine." He looked like he was going to object again. She looked at him in a way that discouraged it, and he stopped. "Thank you," he said. It came out differently than she expected. Not performatively, not with the excess of it that people used when they meant to signal how grateful they were. Just simply, like a fact. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "You've got to get back to Harlan Creek in the state you're in, and I don't know when the weather will allow that." "How long do your supplies last?" She thought about it honestly. "With 2 people? I need to reset that calculation. The rabbit I caught 3 days ago is mostly gone. I have dried meat for another 4 days if we're careful. The rose hips for another week. I'll need to set the snare again tomorrow and have better luck than last time." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the journal, still in his hands. "Can I keep this with me? Read it properly tonight?" "Yes." She paused. "Be careful with it." "I will be." She settled on the floor near the fire, on the south side where the bark insulation was thickest and the warmth from the platform's stone base radiated upward. It was not comfortable. She had learned, though, that discomfort and danger were different things, and she could manage the first without much trouble, as long as the second was under control. She lay in the dark and listened to him turn pages. He read for a long time. She was almost asleep when he spoke. "The entry from the 14th of October, he said quietly. "You noted a discrepancy in the timber weighing records, not the supply invoices, the weighing records." She opened her eyes. "Yes." "You wrote that the recorded weight of the November 3rd load was 3,200 board feet less than what the weighing shed log showed." 3,180, she said. "I checked the shed log against the shipping invoice. Someone had altered one of them." "The weighing shed, someone had altered one of them." "The weighing shed," Thomas said. "That's the old structure at the north end of the yard. It hasn't been used since they built the new one 2 years ago. It's been sitting empty." Silence. She could hear him think, the particular quality of silence a person produces when they're putting things together. "There's something you should know," he said, "about why I came out here in this weather, looking for you specifically, instead of simply taking the journal evidence to the county authorities." She waited. "I spoke to a man named Fenn in Cutler, the one Doss mentioned. He's a creditor, not a reputable one. He told me, and I have no way to verify this yet, that Gerald Holt owed him an amount that a timber camp worker's wages could not have covered. Not even close. The payroll chest," he stopped. "The payroll chest wouldn't have covered it either, not fully." "So Gerald needed more than the chest," she said. "Much more. Which means the chest might not have gone to Cutler," she said. "Which means it might not have gone anywhere yet." The fire popped. A log shifted and settled and sent up a small shower of sparks that died before they reached the smoke channel. Thomas said very quietly, "I think it's still at Iron Creek." She lay on the floor in the dark and felt the shape of that possibility settle over her. If the chest was still at the camp, Gerald hadn't been able to move it. Maybe because the storm had come too fast, or because the opportunity hadn't presented itself, or because he'd been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had been blocked by something. Something like a county school teacher asking questions. Something like a weather reader named Doss who checked fence posts for no reason. "He'll try to move it when the storm eases," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. "That's what I think too. And if he moves it before anyone finds it, the only evidence left is in that journal. Which is why I needed the journal, and why I needed you." He paused. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." She was quiet for a moment. "You came," she said. "Most people didn't." She meant it as a simple statement of fact, and he seemed to hear it that way, because he didn't try to expand it or apologize further. They lay in the darkness, the fire between them and the storm outside doing what storms do, and the 31 marks on the wall held their quiet count, and the new marks beside them, her marks, held theirs. In the morning, she checked the snare before Thomas was fully awake. She moved through the gap in the ice curtain in the early gray light and worked her circuit fast, keeping her body warm through movement, reading the snow for the signs she'd learned to read. The snare was empty. She reset it and moved to the rosehip stand and found that something, a bird maybe, or a small rodent, had gotten to the remaining hips she'd seen from below. There were fewer than she'd counted on. She stood in the cold wind and did the arithmetic. With 2 people and reduced supplies, her timeline was compressed significantly. She had maybe 3 days of genuine food security. After that, it became manageable with difficulty, and after that, it became not manageable. Thomas needed to be mobile enough to move in 3 days. She went back inside. I was awake, sitting up on the platform with the journal open and a piece of charcoal she used for writing on the stone walls. He had been making notes on the inside of his coat lining, just the edge of it, turned out, covered in small, neat writing. His ankle? He asked, before she could say anything about the food situation. Better today than yesterday. You'll know more when you stand on it. I can stand on it. You said that yesterday, and then you couldn't. Yesterday I'd been in the cold for 3 hours. Today you'll see, she said. She told him about the food situation plainly, without minimizing it. He listened and nodded once and didn't say anything that wasn't useful. She gave him credit for that too. He stood on the ankle carefully, with his hand against the rock wall for balance. She watched. He made a face. Pain, real pain, but the controlled kind, the kind you breathe through, and shifted his weight incrementally onto the foot. It holds, he said. It holds standing still, she said. It's another question moving in soft snow. Then we practice moving in soft snow today, he said, because I don't think we can wait 3 days. She looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she did not like it, but she knew it. They spent the day working the ankle, short circuits inside the shelter first, then through the gap and along the base of the rock face where the snow was hard-packed and the footing most reliable. He fell once. She was next to him and caught most of the fall, which was awkward and graceless, and she nearly went down herself. And he said a word she hadn't expected from a schoolteacher, and she almost smiled. By afternoon, he was moving at a pace she thought was sustainable. Slow. Very slow. But sustainable. She had been thinking about the route to Harlan Creek all day. The direct route, 11 miles on the logging road, was out of the question in his condition and hers. Too exposed, too long, the road itself likely drifted over in sections after the storm. But there was a secondary route she'd identified in her weeks of careful terrain study, following the base of the rock face east, which added roughly 1.5 miles, but kept them in protected terrain for the first half of the distance, and connected to the main road at a point where the road was sheltered by a stand of timber from the worst of the drift accumulation. She explained this to Thomas while they ate their reduced evening meal. He listened, asked 2 questions about specific terrain features, and then said, "You've been studying the mountain this whole time." I needed to know my options. You were planning to leave. She thought about that. I was planning to have the ability to leave. Whether I chose to is a different question. He looked at her for a moment. What were you going to do if I hadn't come? She thought about it honestly. Survive the winter. Figure out the rest in spring. She paused. I had the journal. I knew what I knew. I hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Were you angry? He asked. Not accusingly, just curious. Sometimes, she said, less than you might think. Mostly I was... She stopped. Busy, she said finally. I was mostly just very busy. He seemed to understand that this was the truest answer she had. They slept, she on the floor again, him on the platform. And in the morning, the light through the ice curtain was different. She knew it before she was fully awake, the way she'd come to know all the shelter's signals. The light was the pale, clear kind, the kind that meant the storm had genuinely passed, not paused. The wind was a background whisper rather than a structure-testing presence. She stood up and looked at the 31 marks on the wall, and the one new one she'd added last night, the 32nd. She looked at the old marks beside hers, the 47 scratches of whoever had been here before, whoever had sat in this corner and counted their days and survived their winter and eventually, presumably, walked out. She picked up her bag. She checked it once. She looked around the shelter, the bark insulation, the stone cup, the deflector at the smoke channel's mouth, the snare rope coiled on its hook, The fire pit laid ready for the next fire that someone might need. She did not dismantle any of it. "Ready?" Thomas asked from the platform. "Yes," she said. She banked the fire low rather than extinguishing it, left it breathing, minimal, the way it had breathed through all her worst nights. Someone else might need it. She didn't know who. She didn't need to know. She went through the gap first and helped Thomas through after her, and they stood together outside in the clear, cold morning air. And the mountain was very white and very still around them. And the waterfall behind them had more water running now. The thaw beginning, the thread of moving water widening into something that made a real sound, a living sound. She turned east and started walking, and Thomas Bray, moving carefully and without complaint, walked beside her. The walk to Harlan Creek took 4 hours and 40 minutes. Mara knew the time because she counted her steps in sets of 100, and she knew her pace, had calibrated it over 32 days of moving through mountain terrain in varying conditions. It was the kind of knowledge that sounds obsessive until you're in a situation where knowing exactly how far you've gone and how far you have left is the difference between sound decision-making and panic. She had stopped apologizing to herself for the way her mind worked. Thomas kept up better than she'd expected, which she attributed partly to his stubbornness and partly to the fact that he'd rested overnight and eaten something, however insufficient. He used a branch she'd cut and shaped into a rough walking staff, kept his weight off the bad ankle where the terrain allowed it, and did not ask to stop more than twice in the first 2 hours. The second time he asked, she'd already been about to suggest it. She'd been watching his gait change, the subtle compensation that meant the ankle was beginning to cost him more than he was showing. So she said yes before he finished asking, and they stood against a sheltered section of rock face while he breathed, and she checked the route ahead. They talked some. Not constantly. Neither of them was the constant talking type, which she'd identified within the first hour as a particular relief. But in the stretches where the terrain was manageable and the footing certain, words came in the natural way. Words come when two people are thinking through the same problem at the same time. "The county magistrate's office is in Willard," Thomas said, during the second hour. "That's the jurisdiction for Iron Creek, magistrate named Covey. He's not fast, but he's honest, which matters more." "How long to reach Willard from Harlan Creek?" she asked. "In normal conditions, half a day by horse. Current conditions?" He tested the snow ahead of him with the staff before stepping. "Longer. The roads east of Harlan have been worse than this route. So we get to Harlan Creek, you send word to Covey, and then we wait." "Not quite. I have a friend in Harlan, a man named Aldous who runs the general supply. He has a proper horse, and he knows the eastern road better than anyone. He can get to Willard in any conditions that permit movement at all." He paused. "And I can write a formal report tonight. With the journal as supporting documentation, there's enough for Covey to issue a warrant for Gerald's arrest and a search order for the camp premises." She thought about the camp premises, about the weighing shed specifically, the old one, unused, at the north end of the yard, the one she'd noted the discrepancy about in October. She thought about why a man with a payroll chest and a creditor and cutler and a serious problem to solve would use an abandoned weighing shed, and the answer that came back was simple and obvious. Because no one goes there. Because it's been empty for 2 years, and there's no reason for anyone to walk through it. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "In my journal, the October 14th entry, I wrote that the weighing shed log showed a discrepancy against the shipping invoice. I read it. I think I know why the chest is still at camp." He stopped walking. She stopped too, and they stood in the middle of the snow-covered terrain looking at each other. "He couldn't get it out," he said slowly. "He couldn't get it out because the storm hit faster than he planned, and he couldn't move it to Cutler to pay Fenn because the roads closed. So it's sitting somewhere at camp, waiting for the roads to clear." She held his gaze. "If Covey takes 2 or 3 days to get there, Gerald will have a window." Thomas started walking again, faster than before. The ankle was going to pay for it later, and they both knew it. "Then Aldous needs to leave tonight," he said. "Not tomorrow, tonight." They came out of the protected base of rock face route onto the main logging road with about 3 miles left to Harlan Creek. And the last 3 miles were exposed and difficult, and exactly as slow as she'd calculated they would be. The road was drifted in 2 places. She went first through both, testing depth, finding the packed underlayer, marking the path back to Thomas with branch pieces stuck upright in the snow so he knew where to step. It was not elegant, it was functional. Harlan Creek appeared in the late afternoon light as a collection of dark shapes against white. Maybe 40 structures, a proper settlement by the standards of this country, with a main road and a trading post and a church and a school that was Thomas's domain. Smoke from chimneys, the smell of burning pine, and something cooking that hit Mara's hunger like a physical blow. She hadn't smelled cooked food, actual cooked food, not dried rabbit over a stone fire pit, in 32 days. She stopped walking when they reached the edge of the settlement. People were on the main road. Not many, the cold kept movement purposeful, but enough. A woman carrying a bundle, two men talking outside the trading post, a boy running between two buildings for reasons known only to boys. They were not looking at the edge of the settlement where a large young woman in a worn coat and a limping schoolteacher were arriving from the direction of the mountains. Then the woman with the bundle looked up. She stopped walking. Then one of the men outside the trading post turned. Mara was aware of the way she must look. 32 days in a rock shelter showed. She knew this without needing a mirror. She could feel it in the roughness of her skin, the particular quality of her own smell, the way her coat had been mended and reinforced with strips of different fabric so that it no longer looked like a coat so much as evidence. She stood at the edge of Harlan Creek and let them look. Thomas moved past her toward the trading post, his bad ankle visibly costing him now that the immediate need to keep moving had eased. "Aldous," he called toward the open doorway. "Aldous, I need you right now." A large man appeared in the trading post doorway, looked at Thomas, looked at Mara, and said, "Lord," and before stopping himself. He recovered fast. "Get inside, both of you." Inside was warm in a way that was almost unbearable. Heat from a proper stove, dry heat, the kind she'd engineered a rough approximation of in the rock shelter but had not actually experienced in over a month. Her face felt like it was thawing. She became aware of her hands, which had been cold for so long that the warmth hitting them produced something between sensation and pain. She sat down in the chair Aldous pushed at her and did not argue about sitting down. Thomas talked fast. She let him. He knew Aldous, and Aldous needed context she didn't have the energy to provide efficiently. She listened to Thomas lay out the situation in precise, ordered language: Mara's expulsion from Iron Creek, the false accusation, the journal documentation, Doss's information about Fenn, the probable location of the payroll chest, the time constraint imposed by the clearing weather. Aldous listened without interrupting. He was a big man, somewhere in his 50s, with a face that had been weathered so completely it had stopped showing much expression and started just showing character. He looked at Mara twice during Thomas's account, once when Thomas mentioned the shelter behind the waterfall, and once when Thomas described the journal. When Thomas finished, Aldous said, "The chest has to be there, has to be. Gerald Holt was in here 6 weeks ago asking about wagon hire for a private load to the Eastern Road. Said it was camp equipment. I thought nothing of it at the time." "He was planning to move it," Mara said, "and then the storm hit." Aldous looked at her directly. "I can get to Willard by midday tomorrow if I leave within the hour. Roads are passable now. I came in from the east this morning." "He needs to move fast," Thomas said. "Gerald will know the storm has cleared." "I know it," Aldous said. He was already moving to the back of the store, pulling on a heavier coat. He stopped at the doorway to the back room and looked at Mara. "You've been in the mountains this whole time, since they put you out?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. His face showed the character she'd identified. "My wife's going to want to feed you," he said. "You're going to let her." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it as one. "All right," she said. Aldous' wife was named Petra, and she was a compact, efficient woman who asked exactly 0 questions about Mara's situation, probably because Aldous had said something quickly in the back room before sending her out. She simply put food in front of Mara. Soup first, a real broth with vegetables, and something that might have been venison, and then sat at the other end of the table and did her mending and said nothing. The silence was one of the most comfortable Mara had experienced in recent memory. She ate slowly, deliberately, because she knew better than to eat fast after extended deprivation. She had read about that in the camp medical book, too. Her stomach wanted to argue with her pace, and she overruled it. Thomas was at the small writing table in the corner, producing the formal report for Magistrate Covey with his coat lining turned out so he could copy the notes he'd made there onto proper paper. He wrote without pausing much, the pen moving steadily. His ankle was elevated on a second chair, and Petra had wrapped it again with proper bandaging, neater than Mara's field effort, and had said about the first wrapping, "Not bad," in the tone of someone giving genuine assessment rather than politeness. Mara had found that more satisfying than she'd expected. Aldous left before dark. The sound of his horse moving out of the settlement yard came through the trading post wall, and Mara listened to it fade east toward Willard, and then she sat with the space left by it, the waiting space. She had gotten good at waiting. She had spent 32 days being good at waiting. But this kind of waiting was different. This was waiting for something external to move, something she couldn't engineer or plan or adjust with a deflector stone and a coil of rope. She did not sleep well that night. Petra had given her a proper bed in the small room above the trading post, a real bed with a proper mattress and 2 quilts, and she lay in it and felt the warmth from the stove below moving up through the floorboards. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about Gerald Holt. She thought about the morning specifically. The morning he'd walked into her office. She'd been over it many times in the shelter. In the analytical way, she went over camp records, looking for the things she'd missed, the signals she should have read earlier. She found 2. First, the way he'd positioned himself between her and the door before he said anything. Second, the key. The key had come out of her drawer too quickly and too certainly. There was no hesitation in his reach, no fishing around. He'd known exactly where it was, which meant he'd put it there himself. And he'd put it there recently enough that he was certain it hadn't moved. She wondered if he'd done it in the night, while she slept 20 feet away in the dormitory. She wondered if he'd stood in her office in the dark and opened her desk drawer and placed the key there and closed the drawer and felt good about it. She tried to understand the shape of a person who could do that and felt nothing about it, and she couldn't quite make the shape. In the morning, Thomas's ankle was worse for the previous day's exertion, which was predictable, and he was moving around the trading post with the staff and a suppressed expression that she recognized as a man trying to look more functional than he was. She didn't call him on it. He was upright. That was enough. They waited. By midday, Harlan Creek had learned, through the particular osmosis of small settlements, that the woman who'd been accused of theft at Iron Creek and presumed dead in the mountains was sitting in Aldis's trading post. This produced a small, uncomfortable traffic of people with various pretexts for coming in to buy things they didn't particularly need. Mara sat near the stove and let them look. Some of them she could tell were genuinely curious. Some of them were the type who came to see something unusual, the way they'd come to look at a 2-headed calf at a county fair. A few of them were different. They came in and bought their unnecessary item, and then, on the way out, said something quiet and direct. One woman, maybe 60, with the hands of someone who had worked physically her entire life, stopped at Mara's chair and said, "I heard what they did to you. It wasn't right." Then she walked out. Mara sat with that for a long time after. The news came back from Willard faster than Thomas had projected, which told her that Aldous had pushed harder than he'd said he would. A rider arrived in Harlan Creek at roughly 3 in the afternoon on the second day. A young man she didn't know, riding a county horse, carrying a sealed document for Thomas Bray. Thomas read it, handed it to Mara without comment. Magistrate Covey had issued 2 things: a warrant for Gerald Holt's arrest on charges of theft and fraud, and a search order for the Iron Creek timber camp premises, specifically including the abandoned weighing shed at the north end of the yard. Covey and 2 deputies had departed Willard before dawn and would arrive at Iron Creek by late afternoon. They were to be met there, the document specified, by Thomas Bray with documentation. Thomas was already putting his coat on. "Your ankle," she said. "Aldis's horse," he said. "I'll ride. I'll go with you." He looked at her. He seemed about to say something about whether that was wise, about whether returning to Iron Creek was something she actually wanted to do, about what it would mean for her to walk back through that gate. She saw all of that move through his face. He said none of it. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The ride to Iron Creek took an hour and a half on horseback on the half-cleared roads, and she rode behind Thomas on Aldis's mare, a sensible animal that moved with the confidence of a horse that had been in worse conditions and knew it. The afternoon light was the long, low gold of winter late sun, the kind that made the snow look warmer than it was. She watched the familiar country go by. She had walked this direction 32 days ago, on foot, with a storm behind her, and she felt something she couldn't name precisely. Not nostalgia, not dread, something steadier than either. The camp gate appeared. She had not let herself think too carefully about how this would feel, and she still didn't, just kept herself present in the physical moment, the creak of the saddle, the cold air, the smell of pine and snow, as they rode through the gate and into the Iron Creek yard. The yard was different, smaller than she remembered, which she knew was not true, but felt true. 3 of the cabins had visible storm damage. One had lost part of its roof, propped with timber while someone worked on it. Men were moving around the yard with the purposeful exhaustion of a settlement that had come through a difficult storm and was still in the recovery process. 2 of them looked up when the horse came through the gate. One of them was Doss. He looked at Mara. She looked at Doss. He held her gaze for a 3 count, and then he looked down at what he was doing, which was nothing, and then he walked toward the main office building with no apparent urgency and went inside. 2 minutes later, Robert Holt came out. He had aged. She noticed this from across the yard. He had aged since she'd last seen him, in a way that wasn't just time. His face had the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for too long, and had recently started to feel it in places he hadn't expected. He crossed the yard toward her and Thomas with the stride of a man performing authority he no longer fully felt, and stopped 10 feet away. "Mr. Bray," he said. He didn't look at Mara. "Mr. Holt," Thomas said. "Magistrate Covey is on his way. He should arrive within the hour. He's carrying a search order for the premises and an arrest warrant for your son." The silence that followed was the kind that has too many things in it. "On what charges?" Robert Holt said. His voice was even, but the evenness was costing him something. "Theft of the payroll chest," Thomas said. "Falsification of evidence. Fraud against camp workers." He paused. "Wrongful expulsion of an innocent person into life-threatening conditions." Robert Holt's eyes moved to Mara then. She'd been waiting for it. His eyes found her face and then moved away again in the way eyes move from something that's too direct to hold. "Miss Ellison," he said. He stopped. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't more. Not then. He had a great deal to say, probably, had been constructing it in his mind for 32 days or longer, but whatever he'd built had apparently not been built well enough to withstand the reality of her standing in front of him, alive, with a magistrate's warrant on the way. "Gerald," Thomas said. "Where is he right now?" Robert's jaw moved. "He left this morning." Something cold moved through her. Not panic, calculation. "Which direction?" she said. Robert looked at her again. "East," he said. "He said he was going to the supply depot." "He doesn't have the chest," Mara said. She said it before she'd fully worked out why she was certain of it, but the certainty was real. If he'd had the chest, he would have gone west toward Cutler to pay Fenn. East doesn't pay anyone. East is just east. "He went for horses," Thomas said, working through it alongside her. "Or a wagon, something to move weight." "He's coming back," she said. Robert Holt put his hand on the back of his neck, a gesture she'd never seen from him before. "When I told him Covey had been asking questions, I told him yesterday evening." He stopped. He was telling them he'd warned his son. The admission cost him something that showed plainly on his face. "I thought he'd leave. I thought he'd just go." "But he didn't go," Thomas said. "He went to get transport." "He's going to try to move the chest before Covey arrives," Mara said. She looked at the old Wayne shed at the north end of the yard. She could see the edge of it from here, the weathered wall, the half-fallen sign above the door. "It's in there, isn't it?" she said. Not to Thomas. To Robert Holt. Robert's hand came down from his neck. His face settled into something that was not quite resignation and not quite relief, but occupied the territory between them. He looked toward the shed. "I didn't know," he said, "until 3 weeks ago, when I found it." "You found the chest," Thomas said. "Behind the false panel under the Wayne floor. There's a crawl space." He stopped. Gerald had been storing things there for months. The chest. Some papers. A letter from Fenn. He looked at Mara, and this time he held it. "I didn't know what he'd done to cover it. Not until I found everything together and understood the shape of it." She looked at him. He had found the chest. He had found the evidence. And he had said nothing for 3 weeks. He had let her be presumed dead in the mountains while he stood on top of the truth and made his calculations about what to do with it. "You could have gone to Covey yourself," she said. 3 weeks ago." He didn't say anything. "You chose not to." He closed his mouth. He opened it again. "He's my son." She stood in the cold yard of Iron Creek Timber Camp and looked at Robert Holt, who had not been able to choose the truth over his son, and who had let her carry the cost of that choice. She felt the anger move through her clearly. Not hot, not explosive, just present, a clear red current that ran from somewhere in her chest down through her hands and then ebbed. She let it ebb. "Go inside," she said. "Stay there until Covey arrives. Don't do anything else." He looked at her with the expression of a man who expected worse and wasn't sure what to do with not getting it. Then he went inside. Thomas said quietly, "We should get the chest." She nodded. They crossed the yard to the weighing shed. The door was unlocked, which meant someone had been in recently, or the lock had simply failed over 2 years of disuse. Inside, the shed was dark and smelled of old wood and damp, and something faintly chemical, the residue of the treatments they'd used on the timber before the new shed was built. The floor was wide pine planks, thick and solid-looking, but showing the give of age under her feet. She walked toward the back. She found it in the northwest corner, a section of floor that sounded wrong. She crouched, ran her fingers along the boards, found the seam that was slightly wider than the others and had a faint groove on one edge where a finger could go. She looked up at Thomas. He was leaning in the doorway, keeping his weight on the good ankle, watching. "Well?" he said. She put her finger in the groove. She pulled. The panel came up. It wasn't even well disguised once you knew to look for it, just a section of floor cut cleanly and reinstalled with a recessed grip. Underneath was the crawl space Robert had mentioned, maybe 2 feet of depth, running about 4 feet in each direction. It smelled of cold earth. And in it was the payroll chest, the key in its lock, a leather portfolio case, and a collection of papers tied with a cord. She did not touch any of it. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she stood up and turned to Thomas and said, "Don't touch it until Covey gets here." "I know," he said. "I want him to see it exactly as it is." "I know," he said it again. He said it gently, not as repetition, but as confirmation, the way you say, "I know," when someone needs to hear that they're heard. They heard hoofbeats in the yard 20 minutes later. She was sitting on an upturned crate near the weighing shed door when Covey arrived. A spare man in his 60s, 2 deputies behind him, moving with the economy of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have burned away all unnecessary motion. He looked at her when Thomas introduced her, looked at her the way Aldous had, with a directness that was assessment rather than judgment. "Miss Ellison," he said. "The chest is in here," she said. "I haven't touched it." He looked at the shed. "Thomas tells me you've been in the mountains for 32 days. "Yes." "In a shelter you built." "Repaired," she said. "Someone else built it originally." He held her gaze for a moment, doing something with that information, filing it somewhere. Then he walked past her into the shed. The next 40 minutes were procedural, and she stayed out of the way of them, which was not difficult because staying out of the way was something she was skilled at. Covey and the deputies documented everything in the crawl space, the chest, the portfolio, the papers. She heard Covey say, at one point, to one of the deputies, "Gambling debt notes, Fenn's mark, and an office key." And then, "Get Robert Holt." Robert Holt came out of the main building and went into the weighing shed and came out again 10 minutes later, looking smaller than he had before, in the specific way that men look smaller when something they've been holding up has been taken out of their hands. Gerald Holt came back at dusk. She heard the horse before she saw it, coming through the gate at a pace that was still purposeful, still carrying the momentum of a man who believed he was ahead of events. Then the horse came fully through the gate, and Gerald saw the county horses at the rail, and Covey's deputy standing in the yard, and he pulled up. The moment he understood, she was watching from across the yard, was visible. It moved through him from the top down, some quality going out of his shoulders and his face, something that had been held rigid suddenly, not held anymore. He sat on his horse in the fading light, and he was, she thought, very young. She had always known he was young. She had never let herself feel it as the mitigating circumstance it partially was, because she'd needed her clarity about him uncomplicated. But standing in the yard watching him understand that it was over, she felt it briefly. The youth, the stupidity of it, the smallness of what he'd been trying to solve when he'd chosen to solve it the way he had. Then Covey's deputy walked toward him and she stopped feeling it. She turned away before the deputy reached Gerald's horse. She didn't need to watch the rest of that. She walked to the far side of the yard, to the section of fence near the tree line where she'd stood on her last morning here and watched the camp from the edge of her leaving. The sky was going dark in the east and still gold in the west, and the tree line was the same tree line it had always been, and the gate was the same gate, and Iron Creek was the same collection of timber and wire and cold-fogged breath and hard-working men that it had always been. A man walked up beside her. She knew the sound of his boots. "Doss," she said. "Miss Ellison," he said. He stood next to her looking at the tree line. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his shoulders were up around his ears, the way they always were when he was thinking. She waited. I knew something was wrong, he said. That morning, I knew it before he walked in, the way Gerald had been acting the week before. He stopped. I checked his room, found some of the papers, didn't understand all of it. Another stop. I should have said something before he got to you, I know that. She considered several responses. She chose the true one. Yes, you should have. He took that, didn't deflect it. I know. But you talked to Thomas, she said, when it mattered. I was quiet for a moment. Thought about what you'd have done, he said. Figured you'd do more with less than anyone else I knew. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she let it sit. The yard behind them was filling with sound. Men coming in from the tree line for the evening, stopping to stare at the county horses, and the activity near the weighing shed, the murmur of questions and answers beginning to ripple through the camp. In an hour the story would be told, in the fragmented and partially accurate way that stories move through a camp of 60 men. In a day, it would be the version that stuck. Somewhere in the commotion, Thomas found her. I was moving without the staff, she noticed. Walking carefully, the ankle clearly still a problem, but managing it without the prop. He came up on her left side, and for a moment the three of them stood at the fence, Doss on her right and Thomas on her left, looking at the tree line while behind them the camp rearranged itself around a truth it had been refusing to see. Covey wants to take your formal statement, Thomas said. I know, I'll give it. He's also going to ask about the journal. It'll be evidence. He can have it. She'd thought about this already. The journal was the record of what Gerald had done. It needed to go where records went. She'd made her peace with that in the shed when she'd stood over the chest and decided not to touch it. Some things you hold on to, and some things you let do their work without your hands on them. The workers, Doss said from her right. The payroll. Will they get it? That'll be for Covey to sort out, Thomas said. But the chest is intact, the money's there. Doss made a sound that was not quite a word. She understood it anyway. Those 63 men had spent the worst part of winter not knowing if their wages were coming. That was its own kind of damage, separate from what had happened to her, and it deserved its own accounting. She gave her statement to Covey in the main office, the same room where Gerald had pulled the key from her drawer, where she'd watched it happen and felt the floor shift under everything she'd built. Sitting in it now was strange but not unbearable. She had been in stranger places and had not been undone by them. She told Covey everything. She told it plainly, in order, the way she kept records, without embellishment and without minimizing, giving each fact the weight it had and no more. He wrote in a careful hand. He asked 3 clarifying questions, and they were good questions, the kind that showed he'd been listening rather than just waiting for her to finish. When she was done, he put down his pen and looked at her. The county owes you an official apology, he said, for what happened here, for the failure to investigate properly before any action was taken. She looked at him. Iron Creek is a private camp. The county doesn't run it. No, he said, but what was done to you had consequences that the county has a responsibility to acknowledge. A woman was expelled into life-threatening winter conditions on fraudulent evidence. That's not just a private matter. She sat with that. All right, she said. I'll be putting that in my report. All right, she said again. He studied her face. You're not angrier than you appear to be. I am as angry as I appear to be, she said. I just know what anger is useful for and what it isn't. He held her gaze for a moment. You've been keeping records your whole life, haven't you? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded at things that confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then he picked up his pen and added something at the bottom of the page she couldn't read from her side of the desk, and that was the end of her formal statement. She came out of the main office into the full dark of the Iron Creek yard and stood on the step and felt the cold and looked at the sky, which was clear in the way it only got after a hard storm had fully moved through, a deep, dense dark with more stars than seemed possible, crowded together in a way that looked too deliberate to be anything but. She looked at them for a while. Then she looked at the camp around her, the cabins with their lit windows, the main building, the new weighing shed, the old one with Covey's lantern still moving inside it, the gate to the north where she'd walked out 32 days ago, the tree line beyond. She thought about where she was going to sleep tonight, which was a practical question and the right kind of question to be thinking about. Petra at Harlan Creek had told her she could come back any time, and she believed that. Thomas had said the same in fewer words and with more certainty, which was more convincing. She was not going to sleep at Iron Creek. She was sure of that before she'd finished the thought. She would stay for Covey's proceedings in the morning, would do what was needed, and then she would go. She had known this before she'd ridden through the gate with Thomas, had known it the way she'd known to follow the base of the rock face rather than the open road. Not as a decision made in the moment, but as something that had already been worked out through the patient process of thinking that she did when she wasn't aware she was thinking. She had left something behind in the shelter by the waterfall. Not her supplies, those she'd packed, something else. Some version of herself that had been assembled there in those 32 days, built out of cold and necessity and the small daily decisions that no one witnessed but that had accumulated into something that held weight. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with that version of herself, but she knew she was not going to leave her at Iron Creek. Thomas came out of the doorway behind her. "Covey's going to hold Gerald at the Harlan Creek lockup tonight," he said. "He'll be transported to Willard tomorrow." "Good," she said. He came to stand beside her. He was back on the staff, she noticed. The ankle had reached its limit for the day. "You were right about where the chest was," he said. "I wasn't certain." "You sounded certain." "I've learned that sometimes it's more useful to sound certain than to sound uncertain," she said, "even when you're not." He made a sound that might have been the second almost laugh she'd gotten from him. "That's either wisdom or manipulation." "Most useful things are both," she said. They stood in the dark and the cold, and the stars were very numerous above them, and Iron Creek made its evening sounds around them. Fire and footsteps, and the low continuous sound of men talking in the way men talk when the workday is done and the night is just the night. She turned up her collar. She was tired in a way that was different from the tired she'd felt in the shelter, deeper, less useful, the kind that meant the body had stopped producing adrenaline because the reason for it was over and was presenting her with the accumulated bill. She was going to pay it in about 8 hours of unconscious time and would probably be a different kind of functional on the other side of it. "We ride back to Harlan Creek tonight?" she asked. "Unless you want to stay here." "I don't want to stay here," she said. "Then tonight," he said. She took one more look at the yard, at the weighing shed with Covey's lantern, at the dormitory where Betty probably still worked 6 days a week and minded her own business, at the records office, dark now, the lamp she'd kept burning for 4 years extinguished by someone who hadn't thought about what they were putting out. She turned away from all of it and walked toward the horses. She slept for 11 hours in Petra's spare room and woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of wind against the window glass. And for exactly 3 seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then she knew. She lay still for a moment, feeling the mattress under her, the weight of proper quilts, the warmth of a building that had been heated through the night by a real stove with adequate fuel. Her body sent up a report that was entirely different from the reports it had been sending for 32 days. Everything hurt in a new way. The deep, settling ache of a body releasing tension it had been holding so long it had stopped recognizing it as tension. Her hands felt strange. Her shoulders felt strange. She lay there and let the strangeness be, and then she got up. Covey had left with his deputies and with Gerald Holt before she woke. Thomas told her this over coffee. He was already at Aldis's writing table, producing additional documentation for the county file, his bad ankle elevated on the same second chair. Gerald had been transported on horseback, under guard, with the payroll chest and the leather portfolio and the bundled papers all packed carefully in saddlebags. Covey had also, Thomas said, served Robert Holt with a separate notice requiring his appearance before the county board within the week to answer questions about the camp's financial irregularities and his own role in the events surrounding Mara's expulsion. "His own role," she said. "He found the chest 3 weeks ago and said nothing. That's obstruction, or near enough to it. Covey's not going to let it go." She drank her coffee and thought about Robert Holt. She thought about the look on his face when he'd told her that Gerald was his son, the way he'd said it like it explained something rather than named something. She had been angry at him at Iron Creek, and she was still angry at him this morning, and she thought she probably would be angry at him for a long time, and that seemed correct. Some things deserve sustained anger. The anger didn't have to consume you to be legitimate. "What happens to the camp?" she asked. Thomas set down his pen. "If Robert can't clear the county board's questions, he loses his operating license, which means the camp closes or transfers to new ownership." He paused. 63 men out of work. She had thought about this too. She didn't feel responsible for it, exactly. The men's situation was the consequence of Gerald's choices and Robert's choices, not hers. But she felt it as a real weight, a real mass of real people whose lives were going to be disrupted by something none of them had chosen. She'd done their payroll entries for 4 years. She knew their names and their family situations and how much they sent home and what they were saving toward. They were not abstract to her. Could the camp operate without Robert Holt? She asked. Thomas considered that. With the right management, possibly. The infrastructure is sound. The timber contracts run through next spring regardless of ownership changes. She nodded and said nothing else about it. It was not her problem to solve this morning, and she had learned in 32 days of carefully managed resource allocation that taking on problems you couldn't currently address was how you depleted yourself for the ones you could. Aldous came back from Willard that afternoon with 2 things she hadn't expected. The first was a formal letter from Magistrate Covey's office, typed on county paper with an official seal, stating that all charges and accusations previously made against Mara Ellison of Iron Creek Timber Camp had been found to be fraudulently constructed and were fully withdrawn, and that her record with the county was clear. The second was an envelope with her name on it in Robert Holt's handwriting. She held the envelope for a while before she opened it. Inside was a bank draft. The amount was 4 years of record-keeper wages, calculated at the rate she'd been paid, with an additional sum that she guessed represented the period since her expulsion. There was no letter with it, just the draft, and below the amount, in the same hand. I cannot make it right. I can only make part of it less wrong. She folded the draft. She put it in her coat pocket, the same pocket where the journal had been. The journal was gone, with Covey doing its work. And the draft was there now. She thought about the strange economy of that. One thing had gone out and something else had come in, and neither of them was the same shape as what the other had been. She did not feel grateful to Robert Holt. She didn't feel that she should. But she put the draft in her pocket, and she acknowledged privately that he had done the one useful thing left available to him, and that was something. She spent 4 days in Harlan Creek. They were not idle days. Covey's proceedings generated paperwork that required her input, formal statements, signed affidavits, a deposition about the journal's contents that Thomas helped her structure in the language the county process required. She was good at this. She had always been good at documents, at the specific discipline of putting information into the form that made it useful to the institutions that needed to act on it. She worked through the paperwork with the same patience she'd applied to everything else, and when it was done, she signed it and let it go. Petra fed her 3 times a day without comment or fanfare. Aldous checked in twice daily with updates from the county road and from the eastern settlements where word of Gerald's arrest was spreading. The woman who'd told her it wasn't right came back to the trading post on the second day, bought a spool of thread she probably didn't need, and on her way out said, "You look better than I expected." And Mara said, "I had good shelter." And the woman said, "I heard." And that was the end of that conversation, but it stayed with Mara in the way that very brief, very honest exchanges sometimes do. On the 3rd evening, Thomas found her at the edge of the settlement, looking west toward the mountains. The last light was doing something complicated with the snow on the upper elevations. A purple-gold combination that was temporary and specific and would be completely different in 10 minutes. She was watching it. He came to stand beside her, and they were quiet for a moment. The way they'd gotten comfortable being quiet together, which she hadn't noticed happening until it was already a pattern. "The county board met today," he said. "Aldous just got word." And Robert Holt surrendered the operating license voluntarily, before they could revoke it. The camp will be under county administration until a buyer is found, or the workers petition for cooperative management. He paused. Doss is apparently leading the petition. She turned to look at him. Doss. He organized 14 signatures in 2 days. The county will consider it. She thought about Doss checking fence posts for no reason, finding her Thomas, saying the thing he needed to say. She thought about the morning she'd been thrown out, and the way he'd looked at his boots. People were complicated, she thought again. She kept having to relearn this in new forms. "What about the workers' wages?" she asked. "Covey has ordered the chest contents distributed in full. It should happen within the week." She let out a slow breath. "Good," she said. They looked at the mountains. The light was doing something different now. The purple had deepened, and the gold had gone. And in another few minutes, it would be just dark blue, and then just dark. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "Yes." "What are you going to do now?" She had known the question was coming. She had been thinking about the answer for 4 days, not in the way she thought through problems, methodically, from first principles, but in the background way, the way the smoke channel deflector had come to her, not as a decision, but as a recognition of something that had already been decided without her full awareness. "I'm going back," she said. He was quiet. "Not to Iron Creek," she said. "To the shelter, to that area, up by the waterfall. To live," he said. Not a question exactly. "For now." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "Winter's not over." "I know. I have supplies now." She touched the coat pocket where the bank draft was. "I can do this properly. A real structure, not just a repair job on someone else's work. Better food stores. Better tools." She paused. "I know that terrain. I know it well now. I know where the water runs and where the wind comes from and where things grow in spring." "You're not coming back to settlement life," he said. She thought about how to say what she meant without it sounding like a wound when it wasn't one, or not only one. "I don't know yet what I'm coming back to," she said honestly. "I know that I'm not going back to what I came from. Being someone's record keeper in someone else's operation, invisible and useful and patient, and waiting for someone to decide whether I'm trustworthy." She stopped. "I did that for 4 years. I was good at it, and it still didn't protect me from Gerald Holt and a key in a drawer. So you build something of your own," he said. "I'm already building something of my own. I just need to do it properly." He nodded slowly. She could tell he was turning something over, weighing it against something else, and she waited to see which way it landed. "There's a piece of land up there," he said, "along the east face of the rock formation, about a quarter-mile from where the waterfall comes down. It's unregistered territory, hasn't been claimed or surveyed because no one's been interested in land that remote. With the county in the current administrative state, a claim filed now would go through faster than usual." She looked at him. "You've been looking at land records." "I'm the county enrollment officer as well as the school teacher," he said. "I have access to the territory maps." "You looked this up before I told you what I was planning." A brief pause. "I looked it up 2 days ago," he said. "Yes." She held his gaze. He held hers, and there was something in his face that was not quite sure of itself, which was the most human she'd seen him look since he'd said a word she hadn't expected from a school teacher while falling in the snow outside her shelter. "You could file the claim from Harlan Creek," he said. "I can help you with the paperwork. It would be registered in your name under your full rights. Nobody could touch it." She stood at the edge of Harlan Creek with the dark coming down around them and the mountains going gray against the sky. And she thought about her name on a document that said, "This land is mine, and the county knows it, and any man who wants to tell me to leave will have to bring that argument to Magistrate Covey." "All right," she said. "Show me the territory maps." They spent the next morning on the maps. Thomas laid them out on Aldous' largest table, and they stood over them together, and she looked at the rock formation she'd lived against for 32 days from the perspective of a surveyed map for the first time, and it was strange to see it that way. Strange and also clarifying, like looking at something familiar from a new angle and suddenly understanding its geometry. The quarter-mile he'd mentioned ran along the east face where the rock stepped down toward a more level shelf, and the shelf was the thing she'd noticed but not fully understood on her circuits, protected on the north and west by the rock face, open to the south where the winter sun, such as it was, could reach. "Here," she said, putting her finger on the map. "And this section here." She traced the line. "There's a spring melt channel that runs through this area in March and April. If I build on the high side of it, I get access to fresh water without flooding risk." Thomas looked at where her finger was. "You know that from observation." "I know that from watching where the ground color changes. The darker soil runs in a curve here." She traced it. "That's where water has been moving for a long time." He made a note on the margin of the map, neat, precise, in his school teacher handwriting. "I'll need to include a water access description in the claim. This helps." They worked for 3 hours. The claim document was more complex than she'd expected, not in a way that was beyond her, but in a way that required careful attention to the specific county language for boundary descriptions and resource rights and structure permissions. Thomas knew the language. She asked questions when she didn't understand something, and he answered them without condescension, which she noticed and appreciated more than she would have said out loud. When the document was done, she read it twice before she signed it. It felt like she had learned it in a previous life, but it was only 4 years ago, to read everything before she signed it. She found one section where the boundary language was ambiguous and they rewrote it together until it wasn't. Then she signed. "I'll file it this afternoon," Thomas said. "By the end of the week, it'll be registered." She looked at her name on the document. Mara Ellison, claimant. A quarter-mile of mountain shelf and the rock formation above it, and the water rights to the spring melt channel and the permission to build permanent structures thereon. Hers. She had owned nothing in her life before this. She had come close once, 4 years of building something in the records office at Iron Creek, something that wasn't ownership but felt adjacent to it, a place that was hers in the way a place can be yours when you've learned every corner of it and made it run well. And then that had been taken in 30 seconds by a man with a practiced face and a key in his hand. This was different. This was paper and a seal and her own name and the weight of the county behind it. It was imperfect protection. She wasn't naive about that, had learned enough about how power moved and where it pooled to know that paper and seals only went so far when the wrong people were deciding whether to honor them. But it was something. It was more than she'd had when she walked through the camp gate with her bag over her shoulder and the storm coming. She folded the document and put it in her coat. Different pocket from the bank draft. Aldous drove her to the supply trading post in the next settlement east, a larger place that carried the kind of provisions she needed. She spent 2 hours in it, moving through the aisles with the careful focus of someone who has done serious inventory work and knows exactly how to read the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. She bought well, and she bought without waste. Proper food stores, dried goods, salt, preserved meat, grain, building tools that she could manage alone. Better rope, better tarp material for temporary weatherproofing while she built. Lamp oil. Matches. Leather for mending. Seeds, because it was January now, and the seed stock was last year's surplus and cheap, and by spring she would have ground she could work. The bank draft covered it with a significant amount left over, which she converted to county-registered savings at Aldis's recommendation, kept at the Willard County Bank under her name. It was not a fortune. It was enough. She left Harlan Creek on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after she'd arrived. Petra stood in the trading post doorway and did not make a production of the goodbye, which Mara appreciated. She said, "Come back when you need something," and Mara said, "I will." And that was honest on both sides. Aldous shook her hand. He held it for a moment and said, "You're a serious person, Miss Ellison." And she understood this was the highest compliment he knew how to give and accepted it accordingly. Thomas walked her to the edge of the settlement. She had more to carry now. The supplies were distributed in a proper pack frame she'd bought, balanced correctly, a different experience from the improvised bag she'd walked out of Iron Creek with. Her boots had been replaced with heavier ones. She was dressed for what she was going back to. At the edge of the settlement, he stopped. "I have school through March," he said, "but I'm in the territory in April. Land surveys, enrollment updates." He paused. "I know where the waterfall is." She looked at him. He was stating a fact. That was how he communicated things that mattered, as facts, precisely stated, leaving the interpretation to the listener. "The path along the rock base is the safest approach," she said. "Follow it from the east end of the logging road. You'll hear the water before you see the gap in the ice." She paused. "By April, the ice will be breaking up. The gap will be wider." He nodded. She adjusted the pack frame on her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to find me." "I did it because the accounting didn't add up," he said, and then something shifted in his face. "And because it wasn't right," he said, "what they did." "I know," she said. "Both things can be true at the same time." He almost smiled. It was the closest he'd gotten to a full one since the word he'd said while falling in the snow, and she filed it in the same place she filed other things worth keeping. She turned and walked west toward the mountains. The walk back was different from every other walk she'd taken through this terrain. It was not desperate, not calculated, not driven by the specific forward momentum of someone trying not to die or trying to outrun a consequence or trying to reach something before a window closed. She was walking toward something she had chosen, on ground she had already learned, at a pace she set herself with adequate provisions and a registered land claim in her coat pocket. She was tired before she reached the rock face, and she didn't care. The tiredness was the ordinary kind. She reached the shelter in the early afternoon. The ice curtain had changed in the 6 days she'd been gone. The thaw she'd noted when she and Thomas had left had continued, and the outer edge of the frozen falls had thinned and begun to recede, giving the gap a wider aspect. She stood outside it for a moment and looked at the way the water threaded down the center faster now, the voice of it different than it had been in deep January. More present, more insistent. She went through. Inside, the banked fire was completely cold. She had expected this. The bark insulation was as she'd left it, the stone cup, the snare rope on its hook, the tally marks on the wall. She stood in the middle of the space and did what she always did when she arrived. Looked at everything, took inventory, understood what needed attention first. The fire needed attention first. It always did. She built it with the same deliberateness she always brought to it. And when it was going, she stood in front of it and put her hands out and felt the warmth come back into them. And she looked at the marks on the wall, 47 old ones and 32 new ones, hers, scratched beside each other in the stone. She picked up the bone-handled knife. She went to the wall. She found the place at the end of her 32 marks where the stone was still unmarked, and she pressed the tip of the knife in and made one more line. Not for a day survived, just a mark. Just, I was here, and I left, and now I'm back, and this is where I belong for now, and I decided that myself. She started building in February, not the permanent structure that had to wait until the ground was workable and the weather had made up its mind about the season. What she built first was a proper extension to the shelter's entrance, a windbreak structure using timber she cut herself with the hand axe and a longer camp saw she'd bought. It was ugly and it worked, which she had decided were the two criteria she was going to apply to everything she built, in that order. Ugly and working was the only honest standard for a person building alone in winter. Beautiful and working could come later, when she had the time and the resources and the company to care about the difference. She extended the snare line to 3 separate sets and caught something every 4 to 5 days on average, which was better than before. She found, in late February, a section of south-facing rock shelf 100 yards east that caught enough weak winter sun to be slightly warmer than the surrounding terrain, and in the snow there she found the tracks of a wider range of animals than she'd seen near the shelter. She mapped the routes. She moved 2 of the snares. She thought about the 47 marks on the wall frequently, and in late February she had a realization about them that she'd been circling without landing on. The symbols interspersed among the tally groups, the circle with the line through it, the bird or fish shape, the repeating diagonal. She had been trying to decode them as warnings or records. But on a February evening when the fire was good and she was sitting in the back corner, she looked at them again with fresh eyes and understood. They were not warnings. They were instructions. The circle with the line, don't use the smoke channel in this weather pattern, the draw reverses. The bird shape. This is when the game trails shift, look east. The diagonal marks, water source direction from here. Someone had left a manual, in the only language they'd had available, stone and time. She spent 3 days going over every mark again with that understanding, and what emerged was not a complete picture but a useful one. The kind of partial map that tells you enough to move by if you're willing to fill in the gaps yourself. She added her own symbols beside them, in her own emerging notation, what she'd learned about the specific weather patterns in this microclimate, where the rose hips grew and when they were best, the particular behavior of the spring melt channel. The wall was becoming a conversation across time, 2 people who had never met sharing the knowledge of one piece of mountain, and she found this, there was no other word for it, she found this quietly extraordinary. March came in hard and went out grudgingly, the way March behaved in mountain country. The ice curtain at the shelter entrance broke apart in the second week, came down in sections over 2 days, and suddenly the shelter had a proper open entrance again rather than a gap. And the sound of the waterfall was different, real and full and close, a constant companion rather than a filtered presence. She stood in the entrance on the morning after the last section fell and looked at the falls with the cold spray touching her face and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, something simple and unqualified. She started the permanent structure on the 7th of April. The site was where she'd shown Thomas on the map. The east-facing shelf, protected on the north and west, open to the south. She had spent March walking every part of it in varying conditions, in rain and in the last of the snow, and in the brief warm spells that came and went like promises that weren't ready to commit yet. She knew the ground. She knew where it was solid and where it was soft, where the meltwater wanted to go, where the wind came from in different seasons. She built the foundation first. Stone, from the rock face. She didn't cut it, just selected pieces that fit together correctly, spending a full day sometimes on one section that a more impatient person might have forced in an hour and had shift wrong by spring. She had become, she realized, genuinely patient in a way she hadn't been before. Not the performed patience of a record keeper who understood that being seen as patient was useful. Real patience, the kind that comes from understanding that some things have a correct pace and working against it costs more than it saves. On the 14th of April, Thomas came. She heard the horse on the logging road before she saw him, and she came down from the shelf to meet him on the path along the rock face. He was riding alone, with a pack on the horse's back, and his ankle was fully healed. She could tell from the way he moved when he dismounted. No compensation, no careful placement of weight. He looked around at the terrain, at the rock face, at the waterfall which was running fully now, loud and present, the spray visible 20 feet out. "You can hear it from the road," he said. "About a quarter-mile out," she said, "when the wind is right." He looked at the structure on the shelf above them. She had the foundation complete, and 3 courses of wall started on the south and west sides. It was early, and it was rough, and the lines were not perfect, because she was not a stonemason and had no one to tell her when she was getting it wrong except the stones themselves, which were honest if you listened to them. "That's solid work," he said. "The foundation is right," she said. "The walls will take another 2 months at my pace." 2 months is fine." He reached into the pack on the horse and pulled out a long wrapped bundle. He held it out to her. "Land boundary markers," he said, "stamped with the county seal. You're registered as of March 22nd. These go at the corners of the claimed territory." She took the bundle. It was heavier than it looked. She held it with both hands and felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of something official and real and hers. "Thank you," she said. The second time she'd said that to him, and both times she'd meant a different thing by it, and she thought he understood the difference. They placed the boundary markers together that afternoon, walking the perimeter of the claim with the territory map and her knowledge of the ground, marking the corners where the county said her land began and ended. It took 3 hours. The last marker went in at the northwest corner, closest to the rock face, about 40 yards from the shelter entrance. She drove it into the ground with the flat of the camp saw and stood back and looked at it. A red-tailed hawk went over while she was standing there. It didn't circle or hover, just went over, moving west, part of its own business. She watched it until she couldn't see it. Thomas had brought food in the pack, and they ate it sitting on the flat stones at the base of the waterfall while the light went long and warm, the way April light does when it finally decides to commit. He told her about Gerald's trial. It had concluded in late March. Fraud, theft, and falsification of evidence. 4 years in the county correctional facility in Willard, with restitution to the workers ordered from the Holt family assets. Robert Holt had received a formal reprimand, a fine, and a 3-year prohibition from holding a county business license. The camp had been transferred to county administration, and Doss's cooperative petition had been approved. 63 men keeping their jobs, she said. 58, after some chose to leave. But 58 is most of them. She thought about the camp, the morning shifts, the cold, the work that moved from dark to dark, the men who sent money home and saved toward things she only knew about because she'd kept the records. "Good," she said. She meant it simply. Thomas poured coffee from a tin he'd brought, and she held her cup and looked at the waterfall and thought about all the different shapes a life could take. She had spent 4 years being patient in a way that was really a form of waiting, waiting for some external condition to change, for someone to see her clearly, for circumstances to align into something she could build on. She had not understood, until 32 days of mountain winter had clarified it, that waiting was not the same as preparation. That building something, actually, physically, stone by stone building something, was a different kind of patience entirely, one that moved forward even when it couldn't see the end of it. "There's something I want to show you before you go," she said. She took him to the shelter. He'd been in it before. She'd gotten him through the gap and to the fire when he was half frozen and failing. But he hadn't seen it properly, hadn't walked its dimensions, or looked at the walls the way she wanted him to look at them now. She lit the lamp she'd bought, a real one now, with a proper reservoir and a trimmed wick, and held it to the wall. He looked at the marks. All of them. The old ones, 47, in the hand of a person neither of them would ever know. And beside them her 32, and the additional marks she'd made after returning, and the symbols she'd decoded and annotated and added to. He was quiet for a long time. "This is a record," he said finally. "Yes. Of survival, 2 different people's survival, years apart. Maybe more than 2, she said. Some of the older marks look different from each other. Different hands, I think. Different weight in the scratches. He moved the lamp slowly along the wall, following the marks. It's a library, he said. She hadn't thought of it in exactly those words, but when he said it, she recognized it immediately as the right word. That was exactly what it was. Not a record of suffering or a monument to endurance, but a library. A place where what someone had learned had been left for whoever came next, in the only format available, in the most permanent medium at hand. I'm going to keep adding to it, she said. Everything I learn about this terrain, this microclimate, these routes. What grows where. What the weather does. The snare positions that work in each season. She paused. When I figure out who I'd want to teach it to, I'll have something to teach with. He turned from the wall to look at her. You're thinking about teaching. I'm thinking about what this place could be, she said. Not just for me. In 10 years, 20, I don't know what this territory is going to look like. People will come. They always do. And when they do, some of them will end up in the mountains without enough. And what's on that wall could be the difference. She stopped. Not a school exactly. Not what you do. Something that lives in a place rather than a building. I was looking at her with an expression she'd come to identify as Thomas Bray's version of being moved. It was subtle and showed mostly around the eyes, and he almost certainly wasn't aware he was making it. The woman they thought was dead, he said quietly. They were careless thinkers, she said. They saw one thing and stopped looking. Most people do. I know. I used to let it be useful to me. She looked at the wall. I think I'm done with that. He left the next morning, early, with the cloud cover moving in from the north. That meant weather by afternoon. She walked with him to the point where the path met the logging road, and they said goodbye with the matter-of-factness of two people who have established that they are going to be in each other's lives, and therefore don't need to make a ceremony of each departure. April in 2 weeks still, he said, from the saddle. I have 3 more survey stops before I'm back in Harlan Creek. The path along the rock base, she said. East end of the logging road. I remember, he said. She watched him go, and then she turned back toward the mountain. The permanent structure took until the end of June. The walls went up stone by stone. The roof was a combination of timber framing and the tarp materials she'd bought and then supplemented with bark shingling she'd learned from a woman in Harlan Creek who'd stopped at Aldis's store one afternoon while Mara was there and had mentioned offhandedly that her family had built that way 3 generations back. Mara had asked 4 direct questions, and the woman had answered all of them and shown her the layering technique with a piece of paper on Aldis's counter, and Mara had memorized it and gone home and applied it, and it worked. The roof was not beautiful. It was weatherproof. She had held to her criteria. She moved into the structure in July. She kept the shelter by the waterfall as it was, cleaned, supplied, fire laid ready, snare rope on its hook. She checked it every few days. She added to the wall when she had something worth adding. In August, a family came through the high pass heading west. A couple in their 30s with 2 young children and a wagon that had lost a wheel on a rock shelf in the worst possible place. They were cold and frightened, and the smaller child had a cough that sounded wrong. Mara brought them to the shelter while the husband fixed the wheel with the tools she lent him, and she made broth on the shelter fire pit, and she showed the woman how the smoke channel worked and where the water came from, and which of the dried stores she'd left there were safe to use. They stayed 2 days. When they left, the woman stood at the shelter entrance and looked at Mara with an expression she recognized. Not quite gratitude and not quite something else, but the expression of a person who has been in real danger and been kept from it by something they don't fully understand and feel they should acknowledge. You built this? The woman asked. Repaired it, Mara said. Someone else started it. Is this your land? Yes. The woman looked around at the rock face, the waterfall, the gap that was now properly wide and clear in summer, the structure on the shelf visible above them. It's a good place, she said. It took some knowing, Mara said. The family went west. A week later she found, at the shelter entrance, a small package left weighted with a stone, dried apples, a spool of good thread, and a folded note that said simply, "Thank you. We made it." The Varens. She put the note on the wall of the shelter. Not carved, just tucked into a crack in the rock. Let it sit there among the marks that other hands had made, in the company of everything that had been left in this place by people who had needed it and survived it. By the time autumn came again, the first autumn of her own land and her own structure and her own counted days, Mara Ellison had 1 full wall of the shelter covered in notation. Weather patterns, game trails, water sources, plant cycles, seasonal route maps scratched in a careful hand with symbols she'd developed herself because the existing ones weren't sufficient for everything she'd learned. A system, a record, a library, as Thomas had named it. She stood in the shelter one evening in October with the fire going and the waterfall outside doing its autumn sound, something between the thin winter voice and the full summer roar, a middle register that was almost conversational. And she looked at all the marks on the wall, old ones and hers, and the Varen's note tucked in beside them, and the notation that was building into something a person could actually use. She thought about the morning Gerald Holt had walked into her office with a practiced face and a key he'd put in her drawer in the night. She thought about the silence from the men in the doorway. She thought about walking through the camp gate with the storm behind her, believing she had nothing. She thought about finding the gap in the ice and going through it because the alternative was worse. She thought about the 47 marks she'd found on the wall and what they'd meant to her on that first night, the evidence of someone else's survival, the proof that it could be done. And she thought about what it would mean to someone else to find the wall as it was now, full and annotated and useful. Some damage, she had learned, could not be undone. The people who had stood in that doorway had stood there. Robert Holt had found the chest and said nothing for 3 weeks. Gerald had put a key in her drawer in the dark and felt nothing about it. Those things had happened, and they lived in the past as things that had happened, and no apology or bank draft or county document with a seal on it reached all the way into the past to change them. But the past was not the only place a person lived. She picked up the bone-handled knife. She found a clear section of the wall, to the right of everything else, where there was still room. She pressed the tip against the stone and wrote in careful letters that would last as long as the rock lasted. This place has kept people alive. Learn it well. Leave it better than you found it. She stepped back and looked at it. Not a monument. Not a testament to what she'd survived. Just instructions. Useful, clear, forward-facing. The only kind of mark worth making, as far as she could tell. The kind that was for whoever came next rather than for yourself. Outside, the waterfall ran. The October stars were coming up in the gap of sky above the rock face. The same crowded, too deliberate stars she'd seen from the Iron Creek yard the night Covey took Gerald away. They were different from this angle. Everything was different from this angle. She turned away from the wall. She added wood to the fire. She sat in the back corner of the shelter she had repaired and learned and lived in and shared. And she was a woman who had been thrown out into winter with nothing, and who had found something in that nothing that no one could take back. Not Gerald Holt, not Robert Holt, not the men who'd stood in a doorway and looked at their boots. Not anyone. The fire burned. The water ran. The mountain kept its own count, the way it always had, indifferent and enormous and completely reliable. She was 33 marks into